Thank you. It's so nice to be here, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. I'm a school psychologist by training, and I started off actually as a clinical psychologist. And I realized the kids who I really wanted to work with the most were the kids who really didn't benefit from 50 minutes a week of therapy. And what I realized is that if I wanted to really impact kids, schools are the place to do that. And so I'm really grateful to be here. I'm always love meeting with educators. And in particular, my work focuses on how can we create communities that support kids' resilience. And the two things is in both my practice, I was a school psychologist. I worked in therapeutic schools for my whole career. I worked at NSSED. That was my home place for a long time, and so I worked at NSSED as a school psychologist, and then I was a principal at North Shore Academy, which is a therapeutic school for kids with emotional behavioral problems. So the two things that really jump out at me when I think about how do we help kids be resilient, the first is how do we help them be emotionally regulated, and the second is how do we create communities that support that resilience. And so I want to first this morning, and we'll do a little bit of both this morning, but I really want to start with a deep dive into emotional regulation. And so I'd like us all just to take a minute. This is how I start all my workshops, is just to take a minute and both feet flat on the ground. And what this really speaks to when we have both of our feet flat on the ground is it tells our nervous system we don't need to fight or flee. I want you to feel the back of your back against the chair. And I want you to take a moment and just take 3 deep breaths. I want you to breathe in and hold, and then exhale slowly. And we'll do that 3 times. And as we do that, I want you just to be noticing what is it that you're feeling, what are the thoughts that are showing up. Don't worry about it, they'll show up, and then just let them go. But just notice the thoughts and feelings what your body's telling you this morning. So 3 deep breaths, and then we'll get rolling. All right, and then when you're ready, open your eyes, and I want you just to think about, do you guys know the zones of regulation? And so I think they're good we use them for kids. I think they're good for all of us, right? And so just notice what zone you're in. Are you in the blue zone, the green zone, the yellow zone, or the red zone? And I don't think you have to be in one. You could already be like, oh my gosh, this is boring. I can't believe we already did a mindfulness activity, and I've got all of these IEPs I've got to get done, right? So you could be Blello, right? You could be Grello. If you're in the red zone, maybe take a break before we, it'll be hard to have you be in here, actually, if you're in the red zone. So what zone are you in? And then it's a long day. What are you going to need if you need to be checking your email because you've got things happening back at school? If you've got a kid at home, you want to be on your phone a little bit to check that. If you've got to take a meeting, if it's hard to sit for this long, you've got to get up and stretch a little bit more. So what zone are you in, and what do you need? Take a couple minutes to do that with each other. All right, so what I want to have happen today, my hope is that there'll be opportunities to stay regulated. So baked potatoes, potato bar is going to regulate all of us at some level, and then it'll put us to sleep by about 1:30, I think, so we got to be aware of that. But just notice, I guess I want you to notice, if you got to get up and move before there's a break, feel free to do that. My hope is that there are going to be opportunities to connect around these ideas and to reflect and pause about your own practice and how the concepts I'm going to be talking about relate specifically to the kids that you're working with. There's going to be a break. We've got a couple breaks worked in. We've got lunch, and hopefully you've got copies of the slides, and if not, we can get those for you. All right? So I want to start with a story. I was the principal at North Shore Academy and for about 14 years. And one day I was, kids were coming into the building and some kids were getting off the bus down in another hallway. And I hope it's okay that I swear. I'm quoting a student, but I listen and all of a sudden there's this booming voice that says, "Where's Bolton? I'm gonna fucking kill him." And of course that makes me want to go, and who is it? And I realize, oh, I know who it is, it's Michael. What could he be upset about, right? And so I come around the corner, and there he is, and he sees me, and he starts to lunge at me. And luckily, he's a big kid, he's about 6'2", he's a freshman. But luckily our deans are about 6'4", and significantly bigger, and they were standing in between. And Michael started reaching for me. And of course, the deans are like, "Just get out of here. You are not helping," right? So I get out of there, but I hear them tumble to the ground. And there are, several people jump in to help as he's being restrained. And we have to call the police because it feels too unsafe for him and for everybody else. And he leaves in handcuffs, and he's towering over these police officers. And his last words as he left the building were, "Thanks for the fucking chili." And I knew right then what he was talking about. I'm going to tell you the end of the story as we finish up the regulation piece. But what this did was it got me thinking and wondering, what is it that creates this level of anger, that creates this level of behavior dysregulation? And that's what I want to share with you today, is it began a journey for us at North Shore Academy that I think was really, really important and helpful for us. So I want you to think of a student who's struggling. And my hope is we can bring that student, or a couple students, whatever works for you, but we can bring them along on this journey together, right? So that we can apply it and figure out, okay, how can I apply some of these ideas to a specific student? As we dove into the research on this, one of the things we found is that we had been ignoring research for over 150 years. And we've been seeing behavior through a specific lens, and that is through the lens of motivation. And when we see behavior through the lens of motivation, we really have two options. We can use a carrot to incentivize or a stick to punish, right? Because that's what really changes motivation. And the father of this theory, John Watson, wrote a book in the late 1920s, about 100 years ago now. And that book, I like to go back to the original sources sometimes. And so take a look. This is a quote from his second chapter. And the second chapter was titled, "The Dangers of Too Much Mother Love." How about that? When you're tempted to pet your child, remember that a mother's love is a dangerous instrument which may inflict a never healing wound, a wound which may make infancy unhappy, adolescence a nightmare, an instrument which may wreck your adult son or daughter's vocational future and their chances for marital happiness. Don't show your kids affection, right? You're going to spoil them, you're going to ruin them. And now we think this is crazy. Except what do we do when kids are struggling behaviorally? What do? We say, don't give them affection. Don't give them anything to eat. If they're hungry, don't let them talk to their social worker, right? Because that's just going to reinforce this negative behavior. And so this comes flying back. And I want to talk about an option to this, but the research didn't stop there. B.F. Skinner, I'm sure we've all heard of B.F. Skinner, right? He did remarkable things with animals and pellets, and he got reinforcement schedules. He's got animals to do remarkable things. In his Skinner box, he said, "Give me a child and I will shape him into anything." The interesting thing is that, as it turns out, his kids ended up having some significant problems themselves. So it didn't work. What happens is, there's a lot of important things we can learn from his theory. However, what we didn't take into account is that the rat's brain, the rabbit's brain, the pigeon's brain is very different than the human brain. But the idea was, if we can just create the right menu of reinforcement and punishment, if we can just get it right, we can shape kids and we can support kids in whatever way they need. And the truth is that behavioral interventions can control our behavior. You put a gun to my head and there's a lot of stuff I'll do, right? You give me $1 million, there's a lot of stuff I might say, right? But here's the thing that we often forget is that there's a cost. And that oftentimes the things we try and do to get the most out of students are counterproductive. Because what they do is they shut our brains down. And what ends up happening is instead of being focused on what activity we're doing or what we should be doing in this moment, we're focused on what's the punishment we're going to get or what's the incentive we're going to get. And we lose engagement in what it is that we want to have happening. We go from being very reflective, thoughtful, collaborative people to really focusing on what's in my best interest right now. You know, it's interesting, as I was doing this research and trying to understand this better, I started taking spin classes. Anybody here take a spin class? A couple people? Yeah. So, you know, I'm an old guy. My hope when I exercise is to get my heart rate up, right? I get a little sweat in, and they don't have to use the paddles at the end of the exercise. Like, if I can do that, I'm doing okay. And so I go in, and there's like this one morning, and there are about 12 bikes. And I get my bike, and the trainer says, there's going to be a prize for whoever gets the most watts. And the most watts, this is like how fast you pedal versus how much resistance is on the spin wheel. Whoever works hardest today is going to get a prize. And I think, you know, I may be old, but I'm a former athlete, right? I look around, I think I can take these people. And so all of a sudden, you know, she says go, and I am pedaling and pedaling and pedaling, and I am exhausted. I'm beet red. There's a puddle of sweat underneath, right? I need 3 people to get me off the bike. I don't exercise for like 2 weeks because I'm so depleted and sore. That's embarrassing enough. But 2 things. The first is I didn't win. I came in like 8th, right? I wasn't even close. But then, you know what the prize was? A sports bra. I had no idea. Like, and here I was. It didn't even matter what the prize was, right? My wife was really upset I didn't win it. But this is what happens. You know, you put this prize in front of me, and all of my goals in the future go away. All of everything else goes away. I'm just focused on how can I win this now. And the interesting thing I think about theories when they come together and why they stick, just as I think even the same year that Watson's book was published, Ford created his first assembly line. And you know when behavioral interventions do work is with assembly lines. Because we're not asking people to think. We're just asking people to do the same thing faster, right? The thing is, punishments rely on fear and shame. And with incentives, we do the right things for the wrong reasons. So, a couple of examples of this. We've got a lot of incentive programs over the summer for kids to read books, and because we know how important it is. Literacy in elementary school is so important. We want kids to read over the summer. Absolutely. So we have these incentive programs in almost every school and almost every library to get kids to read. And the great news is that when you incentivize kids to read more books over the summer, they read more books over the summer, right? So we think we got this figured out. The researchers, though, did something interesting. What they did was they followed up the next summer when the kids weren't getting incentivized. They wanted to see what happens to those kids. What they found is the kids who were incentivized one summer and then didn't get the incentive the next summer reported reading less. I think the other thing that's so discouraging to me is they reported enjoying reading less. And then when they started to take a look at what books do kids choose when they're incentivized to read? Guess what kinds of books they choose? Very thin books with very big print, with many pictures. They did comprehension tests, and they found that the kids who are incentivized did much more poorly on the comprehension tests. Because the goal when we're incentivized is to get through the book. It's not necessarily to read the book, to enjoy the book, right? What Barry Schwartz says is incentives and punishments demoralize what is otherwise a moral act. They change the question in people's minds from is this right or wrong to is this worth the price? And it's a lot less comfortable to be dealing with is this right or wrong, right? Because so many of our systems are focused on is this worth the price? Another example of this is daycare studies. Anybody have kids in daycare right now? You got a couple? Anybody ever have kids in daycare? Yeah. Anybody ever show up late to pick up your kids in daycare? Right? So this was a problem. There's a daycare organization with about 20 daycare facilities. And what they had people coming in showing up 10 or 15 minutes late to pick up their child. And so they decided, okay, we're going to fine people for showing up late. About a $5 fine. Not a huge fine, but about a $5 fine every time you show up late. And so what they did was they wanted to do some research to see, okay, let's compare. We got 20. We'll do 10 with the fine, and we'll do 10 without the fine. Let's see what happens, right? So here's the data. So the first 5 weeks is just the baseline data. So it's about the same. The white blocks are the blocks without the fine. The diamonds, the black diamonds are the ones with the fine. And so what they did was they took a look, and at week 5, they implemented the fine. Then look what happens. The number of people showing up late with the fine doubled, right? Now, why would that be? Any ideas? Yeah. Exactly, yeah, the cost meant less than the time. Yes, she said the cost meant less than the time, right? So here's the thing. It's fascinating to me. So, what they found was, you mean $5 and I get to go to happy hour with my friends at work? $5 and I get to go shopping without my kid in the cart? That's a bargain any day, right? So here's the thing that happened. So they realized that this is not working, right? So and it persisted, and so they discontinued it week 17. But take a look. The numbers don't change because all of a sudden, when we make something transactional, it's very hard to take it away from being transactional. And the other thing is, it's like, oh, it's only worth $5. For me to show up, for me to show up on time? Well, that can't be very much, right? We put a value on that. The other thing is that they weren't showing up 15 minutes late or 10 minutes late. They were showing up a full hour late, right? Because they could now. When it becomes transactional rather than personal, it's totally different. So what incentives and punishments do, and we need to understand this, is they focus us on what's best for me and what's best for me right now. Right? And there are times where we need to use that. So don't get me wrong. It's not like we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's just know that that's what's happening. That if we want kids to be focused on what's best for the community around me and what's best for my future, incentives and punishments don't work that way. B.F. Skinner says, a person who has been punished is not less inclined to behave in a given way. At best, he learns how to avoid punishment. Is that true for us? We're adults. We're more mature than that, right? No, we're not, right? So I'm dating myself a little bit. We used to have these radar detectors. Like when I get caught speeding, I don't think, oh my gosh, I really endangered the people around me. I think, no, I don't want to get another ticket. And then, like now, as divided as our country is, we are all in cahoots to make sure that nobody has to pay a speeding ticket, right? We're working together like nobody's business. Or as Funky Little Diva says, when I'm in the naughty corner, I don't spend my time thinking about what I've done wrong. I plan how to do it the next time without getting caught, right? So all of this hit home, very close to home with me with my son Matthew. So this is Matthew on his graduation day of high school. And I was not sure if he was going to graduate. It was touch and go. Elementary school was very easy for him. He could sit there, he could answer all the questions, right? I realized I could actually sniff that something was wrong in 8th grade. Literally, I was sleeping, and at 3 in the morning, I woke up to the smell of smoke. And I rushed downstairs, and there's Matthew pulling something out of the oven, and it turned out that it was paper that he was browning. He was browning the paper to make it look like a historic document. He had a project to do. He had 3 weeks to do the project. Guess when he started? Right after I went to bed, right? He didn't want us to know that he was so far behind. So he was trying to do 3 weeks' work in a couple hours, pulling his first all-nighter. It didn't get any easier for him in high school. So he was ashamed to show up without his work, but it was really hard for him to plan and get his work done. So he'd either skip classes or he would just scribble the answers real quick before he went in and show up a few minutes late. So what happens in schools when you show up late or you skip class? You get a tardy, which turns into a detention, right? You got to do a detention. I don't know of a school in America that doesn't have detentions. So they've got to work, right? I mean, we've got decades of research on this, right? They must work. Well, they didn't work for Matthew. Here's the thing. Let me ask you, just to put up your fingers, how many detentions would you give? And if you need more than 10, then, let me know somehow, right? So how many detentions would you give, or how many punishments of the same punishment would you give before you realized it wasn't working? Right? How many? 3? I see 3. 3, 5. Do I have 10? Do I have 10? All right, we got a 10 back there. Do we have more than 10? Anybody with more than 10? So here's the thing. One of the things that happen is we often don't, when it doesn't work, we often double down on it, right? We give double detentions thinking that that's going to work. Well, here's the thing. It didn't work for Matthew. The week before he was going to graduate, Matthew says to me, Dad, I achieved something I didn't think I was ever going to achieve. And I'm thinking, National Honor Society, right? I'm thinking you're going to speak at graduation. I know school's hard, but people like you. Like, I wonder what it is. And then he says, Dad, I hit 500. He had 500 detentions. And he only served 466 of them. Here's the thing, for a guy who struggled in school, 466, that's a 40, he served 42%, 43% of his detentions. I think that's an A. I think he got an A in detention, right? Now, you got to believe that, this just shows, I didn't even know this page existed on the portal. Like, perhaps, I was asleep at the wheel. I'm the principal of a school with all sorts of I had kids coming from Evanston Township High School who were, they knew about how many detentions my son had, right? Like, he was kind of legendary. So, here's the thing. When you've got that many detentions, guess what you can't do? Can't go to prom. Now, how are those things connected, right? Like, are they worried he's going to be late for his date, so they just are going to get in front of that, right? He didn't get to go to Great America. He was threatened with not being able to walk graduation. I got to feel his shame twice a year. Parent-teacher conferences. And I'd talk to his teachers, and they would say, what a nice kid, really bright. When he's here, he always speaks up and is involved in the conversation, always helps the conversation along, but he's missing here's all the assignments he's missing. He's got a 35 in here. I'm afraid he's not going to pass. He's got a 42 in this class. And so as I'm walking and I'm weighed down by this shame that he has to carry every single day, a teacher pokes her head out of the classroom. She says, are you Matthew's dad? And I said, yeah. She says, I love Matthew. I said, I love you. Who are you? Right? And she says, well, I'm his detention supervisor. He does lunch detentions. I see him every day. I love him. Yeah, I've got his ID number memorized. And here's the thing, there's another clue about what's really going on. She says, I hope it's okay. He often forgets his lunch, so I bring in a little extra for him. So he's got some lunch for the rest of the day. What was Matthew's issue? It wasn't motivation, was it? Executive functioning. He couldn't plan his way out of a paper bag, right? He couldn't figure out how to get it done, but he cared, right? Guess what detentions do not solve? Executive functioning problems. We are applying a solution that does more harm than good. And this is the case, and what we're going to talk about, this is the case for all kids when they struggle. There's a story behind that. And when we don't ask for the story, but we just think that the punishment is going to get them there, then we do tremendous harm. Here's the thing. Matthew was honored by his classmates, most likely to be late to graduation, right? So he was recognized. Here's the thing. In 2011, 3.5 million students were suspended. Aren't suspensions supposed to be a deterrent? And yet, it's doubled the number of suspensions that we have. What's the worst punishment we have in society? It's prison. Prison must work, right? We certainly use it enough. Well, take a look. There's a 76.6% 5-year recidivism rate following release from state prison. The people who have experienced our worst punishment, 75% of them end up reoffending, and probably, I'm sure more, there are many who didn't get caught. Because guess what incarceration does not solve? The problems that lead to crime. And yet this is what we all rely on, right? You know what does lead to crime? If we really take a look at what's upstream, 98% of people who are incarcerated have experienced significant childhood trauma. If we're going to solve the incarceration crisis, we got to solve the childhood trauma crisis first. So, all this research started with animal researchers. So what do animal researchers say now? So Frans de Waal was a premier primate researcher, and he said, neuroscience is breaking open the black box to look inside the brain, offering accounts of how animals, this isn't even people, how animals solve problems that rely less and less on the learning theories of the past. Listen to this. Behaviorism is dying a slow death, lifting its head only now and then to feebly try putting a brake on these developments. That's an animal researcher. When we take a look at incentive programs, careful consideration of reward effects reported in 128 experiments lead to the conclusion that tangible rewards tend to have a substantially negative effect on intrinsic motivation. When institutions, families, schools, businesses, and athletic teams, for example, focus on the short term and opt for controlling people's behavior, they do considerable long-term damage. The research has been around for this for ages. The important thing is that we not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to understand the limitations and the impact. And can we begin to marry the practice that we engage in with the science that's been out there for decades? So I guess I just want you guys to take a few minutes. What role do incentives and punishments play in your work with the students you work with? How does this research think about it, change that or support that, whatever that looks like? So as you think about your student, as you think about the other students you work with, how does this apply to your practice? Take a few minutes to share that with a partner. All right. So, all right, let's keep rolling, because I do want to figure out if I'm going to take away the idea of incentives and punishments, right? What can we do to replace that? How do we understand behavior if it's not through the lens of behaviorism and motivation?
Okay, let's all be respectful and pay attention to the presenter, please.
Wow, thank you. Look at that. All right. Well, that just means I'm not giving people enough time to talk, so I'm sorry about that. All right, so I wanted to take a look at things through the lens of emotional regulation. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about the last time you lost your temper. Anybody else lose their temper recently? Okay, we got a couple. Thank you. Thank you. What did you look like? What did you sound like? What dumb thing did you say or do? Right? What mistake did you make in that moment? And it may be that you're not a yeller. You may be somebody who just kind of curls up and avoids things. What did you avoid that caused problems for you or other people? Right? Imagine if we had a video of each of us in our worst moments. Right? So the question is, we're good people, right? We're educators, for crying out loud. Why is it that such bright people can do such stupid things? And so when I said that, that we've been ignoring research for a long time, I go back to Phineas Gage, 1848. Anybody know the story of Phineas Gage? A couple of people, yeah. So Phineas Gage, he was not a scientist. He wasn't a doctor. He was a railroad foreman. And he was working on the railroads in Vermont, where there are a lot of mountains. And in order to have railroads, you gotta have flat ground. So his job was to blow holes in the side of the mountain so we could lay flat track so that trains could get to where they need to go. So Gage had a very hard day one day. His job was to drill a hole, put explosive in there, put rocks and other things, tamp it down, right? Step away, light the fuse, explodes the side of the mountain. Well, one day, as he was tamping, he must have created a spark that then caught the explosive. And this tamping rod came flying out of the hole and went under his cheekbone and out the top of his skull, landing about 80 feet away. Now, Gage, it was bloody and it was brains kind of all over the place, right? But he was still able to talk and he was able to walk. And when he got to the doctors, he was even had a little bit of a sense of humor. He said, "Doctor, here's business enough for you. I'm going to keep you busy this afternoon," right? Here's the thing. The tamping rod went right through this part of his brain, the prefrontal cortex, right? Now, the interesting thing is that he made almost a full physical recovery. He could talk, he could walk, he looked about the same except he couldn't use his left eye. But here's what his people said. They said, Gage is fitful and irreverent. He indulges at times in the grossest profanity. He is capricious and vacillating and being radically changed so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said, he's no longer the same person. He's no longer Gage. He couldn't keep a job as a foreman anymore, right? Here's the thing. When I lose my temper, I could be described as indulging at times in the greatest profanity. I swear sometimes, right? I'm capricious and vacillating. And people would say, that can't be the guy who did a talk about emotional regulation, right? This is what happens for all of us. See, this part of our brain, what we've known for about 170 years, is it has a huge impact on all of these things. And when you think about your students and you think about the students who are struggling, especially in school, when we take a look, these are generally the things that kids are struggling with. These are the things that make school really hard, is when you struggle to manage your impulses, to emotionally regulate, to initiate tasks, to persist, to transition, to have empathy, attention, planning, along with many, many other things. You know, for Matthew, he really struggled with initiating tasks and persisting on them, to transition from a more preferred to a less preferred activity, to maintain attention while he's doing the work, and to plan. His challenges were prefrontal cortex. His challenges were executive functioning, right? Or, I like this definition. Robert Sapolsky, who's a neuroscientist, says this part of our brain makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. It helps us bite our tongue when we want to say something that's going to be a problem. It helps us start a task when we feel like really not starting the task. It helps us write the outline instead of just diving into the work, right? So there's this myth that as humans, we are primarily rational beings. And we are very rational, but our brains were really built for survival. And so there are really three different parts of the brain, and this is a metaphor. It's way more complicated than this, but even neuroscientists still find this metaphor helpful. That there's the cortex, the limbic system, and the brainstem, and they each have really important and different roles. So the cortex is that thinking and rational part of our brain. That's the part of our brain that in order to access instruction, in order to problem solve with people, in order to have the skills you need to plan and all of those things, that's the cortex. The limbic system is really our alarm system. And its job is to say, am I safe or not safe? And then the limbic system, the brainstem, then triggers our nervous system based on if I'm safe, then I can go into homeostasis and I can access this wonderful brain of mine, right? The wonderful cortex. But if my alarm system says, danger, it's not safe here, it triggers my stress response, right? In so many ways, the limbic system, our sense of whether we're safe or not, determines how our brain shows up. And so when it says it's safe, we engage, we can manage disappointment and frustration, we've got all of our coping skills available, we're fully engaged, right? If not, what happens is this stress pushes us into the lower parts of our brain. And then we move into fight, flight, and freeze. And then for us as adults, especially as educators, we want to fix. When we're dysregulated, we want a quick fix, right? As parents, we want to fix it, right? And so as we take a look at this, when we go into these lower parts of our brain, we lose some really important skills, right? These are skills that are not helpful when we're running from a grizzly bear, right? But are essential for us to be successful in school and in life. We're not as good. So think about when you melted down. How good a listener were you in that moment, right? How creative and flexible, how much empathy do we have? We shut all of these things down in order to fully engage in the fighting and fleeing that we're needing to do. I have been married to my wife for about 33 years, and we've had a couple of arguments, one or two. And in those arguments, never once did I stop and say, oh, shoot, I'm doing all the talking, honey. Let me listen to you, right? Hey, I'll bet there's an idea we haven't thought of, right? Let's put our heads together and figure out a new idea. Oh, I just realized we did it my way last time. Let's try your way, right? I want these things to come out of my mouth, right? I just can't access the parts of the brain that help me be the person I want to be in that moment, right? Oh, I'll bet you my tone of voice is, I just realized that this must be really patronizing. I'll really try and do better, right? This must be really hard for you. Or memory, we don't encode memory or sequences, and so that's why eyewitness testimony is so poor. But when we ask kids what happened, their version may be different from ours, and then we say they're avoiding or they're lying, right? For me, some people, have you ever been so angry that you can't find the words, right? Or so angry, if you're like me, that the only words you can find are 4 letters long, right? And you feel like you've got to yell them to be fully understood, right? Or it's like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't say that, I shouldn't do that, I shouldn't say it, right? And then you do, and then, oh my goodness, I shouldn't have done that or said that, right? We can't access the parts of our brain that we need to be able to do this, right? And here's the thing. These are the things that kids need for learning. When we think about the skills that we want kids to walk into the classroom with every day, if they don't have these skills, they can't access instruction, right? But here's the thing. What do we ask kids to do when they're stressed? Listen to me, right? You got to come up with another solution to this problem. That's not working. Have flexibility. The world doesn't rotate around you, right? Have empathy. You need to take the perspective of other people. Tell me what happened. They have a different version of that, right? Tell me what happened. They swear. Tell me what happened. They shut down. Stop doing that, right? These are the things we fall back on. They can't access these any better than I can, any better than you can when we're melting down. I'm not saying we don't ask kids to do these things, but let's not ask them to do these things when they're in lower brain. Let's ask them to do these. Let's get them regulated and then have the conversation. But so often what we do is we try and get them to have the conversation right away. You know, it's not just our thinking that goes. There's all changes in our whole body when we are in our stress response, right? Our breathing rate increases so we can get more oxygen into our bloodstream. Our blood flow goes to our skeletal muscles so we can fight and we can run, right? Our blood sugar levels increase so we get energy. Our pupils dilate so we can see danger around us. Our intestinal muscles relax. Now, why would that be helpful, right? I'm running from a grizzly bear, and I got to worry about my intestinal muscles relaxing, right? But here's the thing. The body shuts down the parts of our body when under stress that use up the most energy. Our brains use up only 2% of our body mass, but use up 20% of our energy. The next biggest system is our digestive system. That's why, if you're giving a toast at a wedding, you get dry mouth, right? That's your digestive system shutting down. Butterflies, right? You might feel sick with anxiety, right? Cramping, whatever that may be, right? This is your digestive system shutting down. And so what we've got to understand is dysregulation is about the activation of the nervous system. Kids don't have any control over the activation of their nervous system. And neither do we. It happens, right? We can get in front of it, and we'll talk about how to get in front of it. But once it happens, we can't control that, right? Dysregulation is not about our emotions. So what puts us into lower brain? What is dysregulating? Here are the things. Feeling disconnected, feeling devalued, feeling powerless, but also our basic needs. Anybody else here get hangry? Thank you, I'm not alone. How about, I get really cranky when I'm tired. Is that, yes, thank you, yeah. It's interesting, I am a much better dad at 9 in the morning than I am at 9 at night, right? My kids, I was an educator, my kids never saw me at 9 in the morning. They only got the 9 p.m. dad, right? They've got no idea what a great father I actually am. It's one of my great regrets about parenting is they always got the worst of me, right? But what are the top 3? These are all relational, aren't they? We feel connected in relationship, we feel valued in relationship, and we feel empowered in relationship, right? And when we don't experience those things, it triggers our stress response. We talk about full brain, lower brain, we talk about being regulated or dysregulated, but at some level, Ross Greene talks about this, but research has actually supported this. This was a throwaway line of his, but he says, when we melt down, it's like we lose 30 IQ points. I think for me, it's closer to 40. Like, I make decisions that are really bad. In fact, if you took a brain scan of me in my worst moments, I think it would look like this, right? It's really how it feels for me. But here's the thing. When there's a dysregulated child, there's a dysregulated adult, isn't there? It's really hard to be with anybody who's dysregulated and stay regulated ourselves. And so, all of a sudden, I'm at minus 30, the student's at minus 30, together we're at minus 60. Is this a good time to solve a problem? It's the worst time to solve a problem, right? And yet there's an urgency that we have. We've got to solve this problem right now. And we'll talk about that a little bit, how false that urgency is, right? But what we know is that when they're dysregulated and we're dysregulated, there's no good solution that comes out of that. So what does lower brain look like? Here's this, so looks like that, right? But this is also lower brain, isn't it? Being oppositional, it's like, just stop the world. I'm going to take control of what I can, and what I can do is I can refuse, right? Feeling overwhelmed. Daydreaming, right? Then you've got some kids who are so compliant, they look like they've got everything going for them, and yet inside they're so afraid of making a mistake. And these kids who are straight A students, top 10% of the class, all of a sudden you find out that they're in the partial hospital program. Because internally, they may not show it behaviorally, but internally this is happening. So what does regulation look like? Well, I think this is the sweet spot for regulation right here. We passed it long ago, I'm sorry to say. But it's dark and it's warm and we can pee and poop and there's no diapers, right? And we don't have to eat the pureed vegetables. And then when we're born, What's our role as parents? All we do is soothe, don't we? All we do is figure out, how do I help this child get regulated? For the first several months, that's all it is. And then they get dysregulated. And then what do? We regulate through soothing. We think we've got this checklist in our mind. Are they hungry? Are they sleepy? Do they need to change, right? And we go through this checklist, and then we say, okay, none of that stuff is working. Let's get them with somebody who their limbic system says is safe. Mom, dad, grandma, whatever that may be, right? And then have you ever noticed that rhythm is regulating? You know, we've got bouncy chairs for kids. We've got music and songs. For adults, you know, there's a hammock. You know, whatever that may be. You know, the interesting thing is that Bruce Perry, who does research, who's a neuroscientist, he says the reason why rhythm is so important for our regulation systems is that anything that is rhythmic, that soothes us, falls within the cadence of the mother's heartbeat. And so, you know, we talk about going back into the fetal position. It's like, let's go back to that place of regulation where we've got the rhythm and we've got we've got the physical posture that does that. The interesting thing is that all we do is we focus on regulating our kids, and then they reach a certain point. And then we're like, forget this regulation stuff. That's disrespectful, that's opposite, that's defiant. I'm going to start punishing that child, right? When does that happen? I think it's right around age 2. We talk about the terrible twos. I think it's when they start getting language, right? And they start understanding the word no, and they do it anyways. I think it's when they start learning to say the word no, and all of a sudden, no, I'm not going to eat that, and all of a sudden we get dysregulated as adults, right? So why do we stop regulating? I guess that's the thing. Our work is still to regulate. I'll tell you, it still is to soothe. When I am having a hard time, being punished does not calm me down, right? What would calm me down? Talking to a good friend, or my brother or my wife, right? What would calm me down? Listening to music, going out, taking a break from whatever's happening. These are the things that calm me down. Being punished wouldn't calm me down. But then here's the other thing. Can we teach them to soothe themselves? Like, that's the holy grail of this, right? But the bad news is we often respond to dysregulation with punishment, which is in and of itself dysregulating. Because almost all of our punishments involve sending kids away, which disconnects, it devalues them, and they don't have a choice, so it's disempowering to them, right? Or we overprotect them. This is not a talk that says, oh, we've got to create environments where kids never get dysregulated. No, we get dysregulated, kids get dysregulated all the time. It's about helping them cope with their dysregulation. It's about helping the kids who become externalizers, as we talk about in their behavior, helping them quiet that so that they can engage in a healthier way. It's about taking the kids who are more avoidant and helping them step into the stress, right? That's our work, because we don't want to get caught in either one of these. So the good news is that time is regulating. Just time is helpful. That's why sometimes we say, let's just sleep on it. Can we take the time when kids are dysregulated to give them the time they need to quiet that nervous system, right? The other great thing is relationships are really regulating, right? There's nothing quite as regulated. Just as, dysregulation may be contagious, but so is emotional regulation. I was on a flight the other day, and I hate getting the middle seat, but this time I was really glad I got the middle seat, because I was sitting next to this older woman. She's probably 80. And we were just sitting down, and it's quiet for a few minutes, and then she just leans over, she says, I want to let you know I hate flying. I'm like, I get it. I'm like, is there anything I can do? She's like, nope, just wanted you to know. So I'm like, well, I'm wondering what's going to happen when we start flying. So we're taxiing, and then I ask her about, does she have family in Philadelphia where we were flying from? Does she have, what are her kids like? What are her kids doing? Where does she live? And she looks over at me. She says, I know what you're doing. And I said, is it helping? And she says, yeah, it's helping. Keep going. You know what it is in a lot of ways, it's my nervous system telling your nervous system that you're okay. Like if I'm on that same flight and the pilot comes out and says, "Oh my gosh, we've never had turbulence like this before," all of a sudden I'm going to be totally dysregulated, right? And so when I'm calm, when my tone of voice is calm, when my body's calm, that's saying nobody here has to run, nobody here has to fight, right? And that's our work. What they do is they call this co-regulation. My regulation can be borrowed to help you regulate, right? And it doesn't have to be only the adult, right? Kids can regulate one another. I think that's the wonderful thing in a classroom that's regulated, is when kids are upset, they recognize that and they can help regulate one another. But words are often unhelpful. Have you ever been really upset and someone tries to give you the answer like blah, 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 and it's like, no, I can't even hear that, right? It's like blah, 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 blah. Or never in the history of calm down has anyone calmed down by being told to calm down, right? And yet this is what we often do. This is our strategy. Can we be present and regulated? Like that's what's most helpful, to quiet that so they can begin to access their language. They can begin to access their ability to listen to us. But that's our work. All right, we're going to try this video. Let us know how it works, okay? This is Michael Jr. is a comedian, but he's talking about, I just want you to watch this because it tells me, it talks about how primitive this is. And I believe if it works for infants, it works for all of us. So I want you to be able to watch what he does as he responds to his really, really newborn child and his newborn child's distress.
Not too long ago, I'm going through some video footage, and I run into this video of my youngest daughter being born. Now, of course, I was there. I actually took the video, but I had never really experienced it from this perspective before. Now, look, we're in the hospital room. She's sticky, and she's baby and all that stuff, and she's in the middle of crying. And then I speak up. I start talking to her, and watch how she responds when she hears my voice. Okay, Portland, look, I'm right here. It's okay. I'm right here. I'm right here. We're doing just fine. It's okay, I'm right here. Right here. Yeah, it's okay, baby. It's okay. That was pretty awesome. So check it. A few minutes later, the nurse starts working on her, puts her pamper on her, and I'm not saying anything, and she actually starts to cry again. Then I speak up, she hears my voice, and stops crying, like again. But I want you to notice what else happens after I tell her that I love her. Portland, it's okay. It's good. I'm right here. I am right here. I love you. Yeah, I'm right here. It's okay. That's just phenomenal.
Can you see how the nervous system quiets when our nervous system is quiet? There's real power in that. And I love it that it's happening in a newborn because it's the same thing. Our nervous systems do the same thing. You know, when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. I like this quote. My daughter taught it to me. She's like, don't just do something, stand there, right? It's a really different idea about what to do. We don't have to fix it right now. Let's just be present. And can we listen? So take a few minutes. How does seeing behavior through the lens of regulation, through this lens now, as you think about your student or the students that you're working with, how does this apply? How can you figure out, when you see it through the lens of regulation, how do we respond differently than when we see it through the lens of pure behavior? So take a couple minutes with one another. All right, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this idea of emotional regulation, and we'll give you some strategies as well. But sometimes you stumble upon an author that totally transforms how you see things. And there's an author out there, a thinker and a writer, a practitioner, psychologist who, like, I read his book, Self-Reg. I'm like, how is this not required reading for all of us? And yet I almost never hear about him. So I want to introduce you to him. And in a very simple way, what he says is so helpful for me. He says, misbehavior is stress behavior. And so this becomes our work, right? And what he says is there are 5 domains of stress. And the first is biological. We talked about being hangry. We talked about being tired. We talked about, there are sensory issues that can show up for us, right? There's all sorts of ways this shows up. Or, sorry for snapping at you. I got overwhelmed because the radio was too loud and my clothes felt weird, right? I had a student who would fly off the handle. Nobody seemed to understand why. When someone crumpled paper, it was so hard for this middle school student to tolerate, right? Then there's emotional. And the interesting thing about kids is they're always experiencing emotions for the first time, right? And they're also experiencing increasing intensity of emotion. So it could be the first time I get invited and go to a birthday party, the first time I don't get invited to a birthday party, the first time I make a team, don't make a team, what it's like when I disappoint my parents, what it's like when my teacher's upset with me, whatever that is, we're experiencing these things for the first time. And oftentimes, especially in puberty, the intensity of these emotions can catch us off guard, right? So that's a stress. There's cognitive stress, and you guys are experiencing that right now, this idea that you've got to sit and focus and use your working memory and apply all these things. And have you ever been taking a 3-hour test and it felt like you ran a marathon? Right? It's exhausting what you're doing. It's very, very stressful. We often think of stress in terms of social stresses, right? People often say the kids are easier to deal with than the staff in my building, right? That the social dynamics can be really challenging. And then he came up with one that I'd never heard before. It's called prosocial stress. And what prosocial stress is it's this idea that do I take care of myself and what I need right now, or do I do what's best for the group, right? So, or for others. So, do I really want to be first in line to get to PE first? Do I sit back, or do I run and bump people out of the way, right? Which is and so the thing that strikes me about all of these kinds of stresses, all of these, is how stressful is school? Here's the thing. School hits on all of these, and we don't get a break as educators or as students. Like when we're at home and we're hungry, we can just go get a snack, right? When we're home and we need a cognitive break, we just take a break. We take a long walk around the block. We don't get to do that as educators. Students don't get to do that, right? We're constantly faced with these stresses for both kids and for us. And the thing that strikes me as I thought about this, have I ever lost my temper, shut down, or avoided something and not been stressed? It's interesting. There are times that as a parent, I can be dealing with a stressful situation and I deal with it beautifully. The next day, the same situation, I totally lose my cool. Is it about the situation? Is it about my students, my kids? Of course I say it's about them, right? I think, oh, well, you're just being such a jerk today. Not like yesterday, but no. It's about the stress that I'm bringing. When I've had a stressful day at work and I'm driving and someone tries to cut in, I'm much more likely to say, no way, you're not getting in. But if I've had a good day and someone tries, I'm like, oh, no, you're in a bigger hurry than I am. Go ahead, right? Not often, but sometimes, right? So what happens, we often say that our dysregulation is the result of somebody else doing something that is problematic for us. But in so many ways, our dysregulation comes from the stress that's happened leading up to that. Does that make sense? Right? So why would it be any different for students? There's something stressful going on for this. So what we often say is, oh, they struggled in math today, but they did fine yesterday. So that must be a performance issue, right? I hate this idea of performance versus skill, because there are plenty of times when I've got the skills. I know I've got the skills to be a good dad. I've got the skills not to yell at my kids. I'm a psychologist, for crying out loud, and I still yell at my kids sometimes. Is that a performance skill, or that's a dysregulation issue? It's not a performance or a skill issue, right? I can't access the skills I need when I'm dysregulated, and neither can kids. When you regulate me, then I can show up in a different way. But the thing is that stress depletes our energy, and this is the piece that I think is fascinating. So Lisa Feldman Barrett does research on emotions, and what she says is our emotions are all about the amount of energy we've got in our brains. And she talks about this as a brain budget. When we have got, when life is going well and our brains are full of energy, then we do fine, right? It's like our bank accounts are full. We don't stress about this charge or that charge. But if we are overdrawn, every little thing becomes harder. Everything we've got to buy becomes harder. And the same thing is true for us emotionally. So what are the biggest deposits? How do we get the biggest bank account we got? Well, sleep, exercise, and diet are the top three, right? When we do that, we've got plenty in those brains of ours. But there are also things that take away. When we've had someone cuts us off in traffic, right? We spill coffee on ourselves. We have an argument with our child or spouse on the way out the door. These are all withdrawals, right? We walk into school and we don't feel a sense of belonging. That's a withdrawal. Right? We have a colleague is disappointed. We're struggling over who's going to use the photocopier. That's a withdrawal. Right? All of these stresses are withdrawal. We get a hug from somebody in the hallway. Deposit. Right? Kids come up and they say, I'm so excited to show you my assignment. Deposit. Right? Can you see how these things work? Right? So I want to take a look at something as simple as cognitive stress. When we think about cognitive stress, what's a deposit and what's withdrawal? And how does that show up? So I'm just going to ask for a raise of hands. Who here is lazy? Oh, we got a lot of people. You know, it's funny, I ask when superintendents are in the room and people don't really raise their hand as often. Well, we're going to find out who's lazy one way or another. All right, so here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to figure out this question. When you get the answer, I want you to raise your hand, okay, and keep it up there. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So raise your hand. All right. How many people have 10 cents? Raise your hand. Lazy. Lazy. Did you check your work? I'm just going to ask, because in school we've got to check our work, don't we? You didn't check your work. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. If the ball cost 10 cents, and the bat costs $1 more, then it's 10 cents plus $1.10 would be $1.20. The answer is 5 cents. Who had 5 cents? We had one with 5 cents. Nice. How many looked at this and were like, I'm not doing it? Plenty of people, right? So here's the thing, you're actually not lazy. And this is what I love about Shanker, is it's like, this isn't lazy, this is our brain doing what it's meant to do. What he talks about is our brains are built for the law of least effort. The goal is to keep ourselves having enough energy to be able to fight to survive. And so physically we need to fight to survive, and we need to keep enough energy in our brains to be able to solve problems to lead to our survival. So if I asked one of you to come down and give me as many push-ups as you could do. I know this group would probably give me 20, 25 easy, right? But at some point we'd collapse. But what if I came and whispered $1 million for every additional push-up? Would you have a little bit more in you? Right? You'd save a little bit. And this is how our brains work, too. The goal is to keep our brains with enough energy so that if things go badly, we've got those resources available to us. What they did, oh, by the way, 50% of MIT and Harvard grads got that question wrong. So you're not lazy, I promise, you're not lazy, right? But what they did was they gave people problems like this to solve, and they put them in a laboratory, and they were able to determine within the blink of an eye, within a millisecond, whether they would answer impulsively or quit based on whether or not their pupils were dilated. Anybody remember what we said about pupils dilating? That it's a sign of dysregulation, right? So we get dysregulated when we get to a point where we no longer have the resources to solve a problem, and we shut it down. What Kahneman talks about is this inverted V curve that we'll work on it, and then at some point we just give it up. I'm done. I'm not going to check my work. I'm done. Right? I'm going to look at this, too hard to do. I'm not going to do it. Right? He talks about this as the intolerable peak. We get to this point where we can't tolerate it anymore, so we shut it down. Or this limbic break. Our limbic system saying, you're in danger. You got to shut things down. And our hypothalamus is actually in our brain measuring how much glucose we have in our brain to solve the problems. The interesting thing is it's a little bit like our gas light, isn't it? Our gas light on our cars go off before we run out of gas. It's like, no, you better stop and get gas now, right? It wouldn't do much good if we ran out of gas and then it went off, right? That wouldn't help. Our brain is the same way. Before we run out of gas, it's going to tell us we got to shut this down. Does this make sense? So we've got enough energy left over. But here's the thing, the more depleted we are when we start a task, the sooner we reach this, right? So let's say we've got 2 kids. One kid gets a great night's sleep, comes downstairs, Mom and Dad are sitting there. We got blueberry pancakes on the griddle, right? They hop in the car and go to school together, and they listen to whatever music they want, and they get out of the car, and Mom or Dad gives them a hug and a kiss goodbye. They walk in. They of course hit the winning shot in the basketball game last night, and so the assistant principal gives them a high five. They walk into the classroom, and the teacher says, "I love your essay. That was awesome." They go back, and all their buddies are hanging out there, and they're laughing and having a good time before class starts. Deposit, 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 right? All of these things are building that brain bank account. How about the other kid? Parents are just divorced, staying with Mom, doesn't have all the furniture in the house yet, so he's sleeping on the couch. Mom has to leave early to go to work. Left his backpack at Dad's house, doesn't know where to catch the bus. He's late for the bus, rushes out, no food. Bus driver says, "If you're late again, I'm not waiting for you." Sits on the bus, nobody's talking to him because it's a new bus ride. He doesn't know anybody, gets out. The assistant principal says, "If that happens again on the playground during recess, you're not going to have recess for the rest of the month." Walks into class, says, teacher says, "Where's your essay?" He says, "I left my backpack at my dad's house last night." "Sure you did. You've always left your backpack at your dad's house." Right? Sits down at his desk, puts his head down because he's tired because he didn't sleep well. Withdrawal, 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 withdrawal. Right? And so we got different kids. The first kid is way down here. When stress happens, they've got a lot of room for stress to happen, and I can still handle this. We've got the second kid who's starting first period right about here, right? And he's very quick to falling off that. I'll do my work at right about 7:30 at night. I shut down. I can't. My brain doesn't work anymore, so I get to shut it down. If I had to keep working, my work would really suffer from that, and so would my mood. So some children are more vulnerable to this because they start up here. What is it? Attention problems. If you've experienced trauma, if you're a slow processor, development, past failure, vision or hearing problems, right? Discrimination, poverty, family stress, social stress, school stresses, all put us up here. And then it's much quicker before we melt down. So what does that look like when we hit that intolerable peak? Well, it looks the same, doesn't it? It's all the same. We have different ways of shutting down, right? And so what is trauma? Trauma is simply toxic stress. Trauma is a constant depletion of our brain bank. We're constantly overdrawn. Trauma is described from the Greek word wound. The wound in childhood trauma is a prolonged activation of the stress response. They're constantly stressed. So they're constantly just at the edge of that. Trauma is physically and emotionally dysregulating, and it impacts all of these systems, right? So when we talk about ACEs, you may have heard about ACEs, but ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. ACEs are events of trauma, right? So how do those events of trauma show up for kids? Well, kids with 0 experiences of trauma, only 3% of them are identified with behavior problems. But if you've got 4 or more instances of trauma or ACEs, you're 32 times more likely to be identified. The kids who are struggling the most are having constantly having their brain banks depleted. All right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about the stresses that are impacting your students, okay? And what I'm going to do is have you do that as you walk into your break. You can share, you can take a break, full break, or you can talk about this last piece, whatever it is. But let's take a break. It's 10:49, so let's come right back at 11:05. All right, so take whatever time you need, but you've got until 11:05. We'll get started right away at 11:05. All right, let's get rolling. So I guess I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what does this mean for schools, right? How does this show up? The first thing we need to do is to regulate ourselves first. And this is some of the hardest work that we did at North Shore Academy. But here's the thing. It's really hard for us to be able to support kids when we don't have access to these things ourselves, right? And so the thing that we realized is that at this point, this was about 15 years ago, and we really hadn't been talking about emotional regulation much. And people felt shame in talking about their dysregulation. It was like, oh, kids get dysregulated, but that's immature. I would never get dysregulated like that, right? And in fact, it shows up differently. I had a very thoughtful, caring school social worker. No, he's a school psychologist, actually. And he said, no, I don't get dysregulated because and he was always had this calm persona. But just because you're not a yeller doesn't mean you don't get dysregulated. He would say, at one time he's like, yeah, no, I don't get dysregulated. I'm not dysregulated now, but that student's not coming back into my class for the next 3 weeks. And I don't care what's going on in his life outside of here. You can't treat people like that. Right? Very calmly. But what did you see show up? Right? This kid's not coming back into my class. There's no flexibility. I don't care what happened to him. He's a very empathetic guy. In that moment, he didn't have empathy. Right? I have great care for my kids, and there are times when I've got this incredible lack of empathy. Right? Because I'm dysregulated. I can't access it. And so one of the things we needed to get by was this barrier of it's shameful to get dysregulated, to really shift that to we get dysregulated all the time, multiple times a day. All of us do. It's a part of the human condition. And the problems occur when we deny our dysregulation. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. So they did a study. They looked at 1,400 parole hearings. They wanted to see who got parole and who didn't get parole. And so they took a look at how violent the offense was, all sorts of things. How long they'd been incarcerated, how their behavior was in incarceration, did they express remorse, all these things. There was one thing that determined whether people got probation or not, parole or not. And it was time of day. The people who had the 8:30 parole hearing, 40% of those people got parole. If they had the 11:30 parole hearing, none of them got parole. What was happening? They were sitting, listening. They were hungry, right? Their energy was low because they had been focused so much. What do we lose? We lose flexibility. We lose empathy, right? Just like you guys are doing now. That's why we're not going to do I'm not going to have you evaluate me right now. This is the worst time. That would be crazy, right? So this is what happens, right? And the judges didn't mean to have their appetites and their length of time sitting impact their decisions, and yet there it was. All right, how about seminary students? Princeton seminary students. Now, these guys don't get dysregulated, right? I mean, they're like salt of the earth kind of guys, you got to believe. So these guys they were all men. I don't know why. Maybe they weren't. In the picture, they're all men. And so what they did was they gave these seminary students an assignment to create a sermon and deliver a sermon on the Good Samaritan. So now, my dad was a minister. I'm going to do my best to share an interpretation of kind of the most common, I think, interpretation of the Good Samaritan, which is there's a guy lying naked and bloody on the side of the road. And the religious elders kept a wide berth, staying far away from that person. And it was a Samaritan, a non-religious person, who went, picked this person up, took them to an inn, paid for them until they got better, right? And one of the interpretations is that it's really a warning, a parable against religious elders losing sight of the pain and the pain of the people that they are their parishioners, right? So these young men, or maybe young women, young men and women, these young seminary students prepared the sermon, and they went to deliver the sermon at the chapel. But they were told that they're at the wrong chapel, and that they had to go to the chapel. They were supposed to deliver the sermon at the chapel on the other side of campus, and they were going to be late delivering their sermon. Anybody else get a little nutty when they're late, right? So these guys hauled across campus, and these researchers made sure they had to go through a small alley. And in that small alley, they put a person in ripped clothes, bleeding and groaning on the ground. They wanted to see how many seminary students on their way to giving a sermon on the Good Samaritan stopped to help this person who was clearly in need. 90% of them stepped over this person to get to their sermon, right? Again, they were dysregulated. They can still be caring people, but when they're dysregulated, they can't see pain and hurt in the same way. And then anesthesiologists make they don't make many errors, 3 times more errors in the afternoon than in the morning. So, if you get nothing else out of today, get your parole hearing and your operations first thing in the morning, all right?
Based on that, was there ever changes made on any of that? Was there something that they were trying to do once they knew that information?
So the question is, based on this, did the parole hearings do anything to change that? And I'm actually not sure. But I do know that it's well-known research right now, partly because it made it into the common language because it's such a crazy thing that we can also all relate to, right? But I would hope that they've made changes. There's actually, I listened to some, I think there's an episode on This American Life of how parole hearings were happening. I'm not sure if it was before or after the research, but it's fascinating. Good question. I don't have an answer to it, though. There's one more example I want to give, and again, it involves the justice system. In Louisiana, they love their football. And so what they did was they wanted to see what would happen. Did judges change their rulings based on whether the team lost in an upset the weekend before? Here's what they found, that after an upset loss, when the team loses in an upset, judges in Louisiana add 1,296 days of punishment to juvenile defenders the next week. They aren't saying they lost, the team lost, so I'm going to be really hard on these young kids. But their mood impacts, their dysregulation impacts their empathy, which impacts their sentencing decisions. It shows up for all of us in each of our own ways. The thing is that these feelings catch us off guard when we're not aware of them. And we make our worst student decisions when we are dysregulated. You know, the hallmarks of dysregulation are the sense of urgency. It's got to happen. We got to solve this right now, this urgency to fix, right? And we exaggerate what's going to happen if we don't. Right? There's a fight on the playground. We got to suspend those kids right away, or else the playground's going to be up for grabs for the rest of the year, right? But this is what ends up happening. Right? There's this urgency to do it now, and there's this exaggeration about if we don't do something, terrible things are going to happen. Because this is our trauma. This is our more primitive part of our brain, just wanting to stay safe. The question I ask is, do I have the relationship in this moment? And am I regulated? Because it doesn't have to be me, and it doesn't have to be now. Right? We can make this decision later. We can, if I'm the person they're upset with, like with Michael, it was important for me to get out of the way while he was dysregulated from that chilly story in the beginning, right? All right. So when we don't, anybody remember the Breakfast Club? We got a little Breakfast Club clip for you, all right? I think the computer's, the thing is on now. So let's give this a go. This is I guess I want to say, I'm showing this because I know that as much as I don't want to have ever been this assistant principal, I've been this assistant principal, right? That this idea of continuing to engage in a power struggle and use my power in these moments with kids who are also doing the same thing. So let's take a look at how this works out. Again, there's some swearing, my apologies. What's that?
Can you turn on the closed captions?
I can't. Sorry. Let's see. It may not work anyways.
You're not fooling anybody, Bender. The next screw that falls out is gonna be you.
Eat my shorts.
What was that?
Eat my shorts.
You just bought yourself another Saturday, mister.
Crushed.
You just bought one more right there.
Well, I'm free the Saturday after that. Beyond that, I'm gonna have to check my calendar.
Good, because it's gonna be filled. We'll keep going. You want another one? Say the word, just say the word. Instead of going to prison, you'll come here. Are you through?
No.
I'm doing society a favor.
So?
That's another one right now. I've got you for the rest of your natural born life if you don't watch your step. You want another one?
Yes.
You got it. You got another one right there. That's another one, pal.
Cut it out!
You through?
Not even close, bud.
Good. You got one more right there.
You really think I give a shit?
Another. You through?
How many is that?
That's 7, including one when we first came in and you asked Mr. Vernon here whether Barry Manilow knew that he raided his closet.
Now it's 8. You stay out of it.
Excuse me, sir, it's 7.
Shut up, Pee-wee. You're mine, Bender. For 2 months, I got you. I got you.
What can I say? I'm thrilled.
Oh, I'm sure that's exactly what you want these people to believe. You know something, Bender? You want to spend a little more time trying to do something with yourself and a little less time trying to impress people. You might be better off. Right, that's it. I'm going to be right outside those doors. The next time I have to come in here, I'm cracking skulls.
Right? Have you ever been in a situation with your own kid, right, where all of a sudden, you know, my son, when I get into this, we talk about it now as mutually assured destruction, right? I'm going to keep pushing this. At North Shore Academy, it used to be that you'd get you'd get 2 periods in the quiet room for swearing, and so the student would swear, and then he'd say, "Now you got extra quiet room, you got to go to the quiet room. Fuck you. Now you got 4 periods. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Okay, now you got 8 periods." And then it's like, rah, 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 right? And all of a sudden, by the time you're at the quiet room, they've got 54 periods in the quiet room. Guess who that doesn't work for? The student at all. Guess who else it doesn't work for? Me, who's got to watch the student for 5 days in the quiet room, right? But here, this is our dysregulated brain, each of us trying to get control. And it's essential that we don't. And it's interesting, I think that there are some unwritten rules of school. And the first is we should never back down from a limit we've set. Have you ever heard that one, right? Here's the interesting thing. What we're saying is we're going to double down on our inflexibility, even if we've made a bad decision. And what are we asking kids to do? To rethink their decisions and to be flexible, right? I think it would be much better for me to give Bender 54 periods in the quiet room and then say, "I really lost my cool. Why don't we talk about what happened and let's figure out how you don't have to spend every Saturday here and I don't have to spend every Saturday here with you. Let's figure this out," right? The other thing is we always have to support the limits others have set. So often, the person who's setting the limits in these moments is the most dysregulated person in the building. right? Are they the best person to make a decision about what's going to be best for this student in this moment? Not at all, right? And yet we all have to follow the person whose temporary IQ is the lowest of anybody's in the building, right? For me, the work then is how can we figure out how do we get that person regulated? We don't have to make a decision on the punishment right now or the consequence or whatever we want to call it. Let's get that person regulated in the room, but let's get other people in the room. And let's make these decisions as a team when they're important, right? So that nobody's dysregulation determines what we do. You know, we all look different when we're dysregulated. How does your dysregulation show up at work? Right? I look different when I'm at work than when I'm at home in my dysregulation. I had a colleague who know that my dysregulation when I'm leading meetings, she'd say, I know when the meeting's going to go south is when you start rubbing your face. Like that was my tell, right? And I wouldn't yell in the way that I sometimes yell at home, but it does show up in other ways, right? So I want you to think about what dysregulates you at work. What does your dysregulation look like, and how does it impact other people? If you're with people you know, you may find out that you do have some tells too. Like if you're with someone you know, say, how does my dysregulation show up? How do you know when I'm dysregulated? So take a few minutes and just reflect on your own dysregulation, how it shows up, what are the things that trigger it, and then let's figure out what we can do to take care of that. All right. I'm going to give you some more strategies just to help us think through what are some things that we can do. And it's interesting. I had a district say, you know, I want tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And what I realized is with regulation, I would put a lot of these things in tier 1. And most people would say, no, this isn't tier 1 stuff. We don't have time to do this stuff tier 1. And yet I think it's essential when we talk about emotional regulation that we do. I think we could get in front of a lot of challenges if we did that. So the first is, can we assess dysregulation? We can't manage it if we aren't aware of it. And so I think this idea of constantly, because our regulation shifts throughout the day, right? We often only do regulation check-ins with kids with disabilities. I think all kids could benefit from it, from noticing this, right? So the work is to teach kids to notice what's happening to me in my mood, what's happening in my body, what's happening with my energy. And then once we can figure that out, then we can address it. But oftentimes it catches us off guard. So this is the ruler tool that comes out of Yale, and a lot of schools are using this now as a way of doing this. We already talked about zones. You know, someone that I really like what he did. We were talking about this. He's a social study. I mean, he's a science teacher, 6th grade science teacher. And after he heard us talk, he had students. What he did was he had students fill out this Google form every day when they come into class. They fill out this form. And then he gives them an icebreaker. And while they're doing the icebreaker, he reads the form. So how am I feeling today? So then he has, I'm not crazy about some of these, but he's like, how am I feeling today? I'm here. I might or might not participate. I'm glad to be here and I'll participate. What do I need to be present, right? What are the tools I need? I may need to go get a drink of water. I may need to stand up at a lab station. I'm okay. I don't need anything right now. Right? But this is a way of without taking any time away from class except for the 30 seconds or so it took to fill out the form. And then anything else I should know. I bought something in a game even though no real money was spent. I'm worried that I bought the wrong thing, right? It's like, oh, okay, that's good to know that's on your mind, right? But here's the thing. You know, if there are a lot of if there are a lot of kids coming in who are struggling, or one kid who's struggling, then he can get the class ready and he can go and check in with them. First year English teacher, freshman English teacher, Gen Ed would have kids come in and just, where's your energy at today, right? And so no language, right? There was no language expressed. There was no time taken. And yet, if everybody's coming in with a 1 or a 2, then okay, we better talk about what happened in lunch period, right? Figure out what's going on. If there's a couple of kids who need support, then it's like, I'm going to get the class started. I'm going to go figure out who are the 1s and 2s. I can check in with them, right? On our team meetings, I think check-ins are essential. How can we check in with one another? to see what we're bringing into these meetings. That's why I like starting with a little moment of mindfulness and a check-in with one another. And I like this. It's a far side, but it kind of gets at what we're talking about, right? What energy are we bringing in? Can we know what's happening for other people? Well, it's a delicate situation, sir. Sophisticated firing system, hair trigger mechanisms, and Bob's wife just left him last night. So you know his mind's not really into this, right? What are we bringing into these meetings? The next strategy is how do we teach regulation? You know, challenging behaviors are just signs of dysregulation. So what does that mean? That means we get to teach regulation in that moment. Right? We would never do with a math problem what we do with behavior problems. We would never say to a kid who continues to get a math problem wrong, all right, get up, go to the go to the dean's office, sit there for 45 minutes, and then come back, and I'm going to expect that you're going to know how to figure out this math problem. We wouldn't do that. So can we take the same, can we say, okay, there's a dysregulation, but now is our time to dive in and figure out what's happening? You know, Larry Steinberg says the capacity for self-regulation is probably the single most important contributor to achievement, mental health, and social success. I think, what is our role as educators? I think it's exactly this, achievement, mental health, and social success. If we can do that, we've done a pretty good job, and yet, do we ever teach emotional regulation? If it's at the core of all this, right? So we implemented zones of regulation as a way to teach kids. We also taught a brain science class where we did a lot of this work, where we talk about the different parts of the brain. I worked with a teacher, a principal who was a principal of a school that had been identified as a struggling school, and so he had all these funds, and what did he use his funds for? He used his funds to help kids learn breathing, among other things, Tier 1, right? If we can teach kids to breathe, it's amazing, there's nothing. It decreases cortisol levels immediately, reducing the feeling of stress. Nothing does this like breathing. And so this is Mr. Sefcek at Stanton Fox's up in the northern part of the state. And he taught all of his students to box breathe. And so box breathing is pretty simple. And it's actually what Navy SEALs and other people use to stay calm is we breathe in for 4 seconds, we hold it for 4 seconds, we breathe out for 4 seconds, and then we hold that for 4 seconds. And we just do that, right? And so what he would do is he would ask kids when they were struggling, at first he'd teach them all, but then when they're struggling, he'd say, just do some breathing before we do anything. Choose a square or rectangle. And so what he would do is, they do their box breathing by using something, the table, their phone, whatever it may be, to help them do the box breathing. And what he found is that there was a 30% decrease in write-ups, a 40% decrease in classroom discipline referrals, and a 16% decrease in absenteeism. What a difference, right? And it's that along with some other things, but when he would see a kid who's struggling and it got them through a struggle, he'd say, what was your box? They'd say, I used the window on the door over there. It became that much a part of things. A student said, when Mr. Sefcek did box breathing with us, it helped me focus on myself and my teacher's directions. I let go of any bad feelings, and then I had room for good feelings, right? And then, of course, can we co-regulate? Can we help their nervous system quiet through our nervous system, right? And then once we get them to a regulated place, it's our opportunity to be curious. So can we be curious? You know, what Ross Greene says is kids do well if they can. And he says doing well is always preferable to not doing well. So when kids aren't doing well, let's figure out why it is. And so when kids are struggling, the thing that I would ask is, why are you doing this behavior? But what's stressful about this moment right now? What was stressful about that moment last period? Because we know it's based on stress. And when in doubt, listen, because there are always themes. So I was asked to observe a kid in a classroom, and I didn't actually end up having to go because they solved the problem before I got there. But the student was a first grade student. He had a one-to-one assistant because he struggled with behavior. and transitions. And so he would do a little transition activity, walking, go to the office, come back, get a drink of water, and then he'd come in, and during circle time, everybody was already set up in the circle. And he'd come in, and for the kids would be leaning back, and he would stand on their fingers. Guess what? You get kicked out of circle time pretty quickly when you're standing on fingers. It's not like, okay, we're gonna ignore that, right? That doesn't happen. So they kept kicking him out. And so, someone said, I wonder why he's doing that. And they said, well, he just hates circle time. So finally, the teacher decided to ask him. And he says, why do you, help me understand why you step on kids' fingers. And he says, I hate circle time. And they're like, see, he hates circle time. But the teacher was smart, and she said, yeah, but you hate math too. What is it about circle time? And he paused, and he said, I don't know where to sit. So here's a kid with social skills problems coming in. He doesn't feel comfortable asking kids to move. And so he steps on their fingers. The teacher says, and I love what she said, what do you think we should do? And he said, can I sit next to you? And she said, sure. So every day after that, she made a little place for him. And guess what? There's no more stepping on fingers, right? But it took asking. See, the thing is that listening always comes before fixing. But we often want to fix before we listen and truly understand it. And then, can we understand that challenging behaviors are simply signs of dysregulation? Our dean of students, I just love what he said. He said, when I see a student who's struggling, I think about two things. He says, I think, what would I need if I was in their place? Right? There's real empathy there. And to be honest with you, if I'm arguing with my wife and she says, take this processing sheet and go to the garage and fill this out and come back in 45 minutes, that wouldn't really help me that much, right? And if you don't fill it out right, you're not going to hang out with your brother this weekend. Nope, that wouldn't help, right? And then he says, I always try and figure out what I can put on the table instead of what I can take away. I love this, because what do we put on the table? We put regulation strategies on the table, don't we? Do you want to listen to some music, right? Do you want to, do you want to take a walk? Do you want to talk to your favorite social worker? Do you want to, whatever it may be, do you want to play Legos for a few minutes before we talk about this? These are all regulation strategies, aren't they? And then we begin to learn, what are the regulation strategies that help them? And some of their ideas may not work out very well. We had students who said, I want to go for a walk. And we realized there's something very different between walking and wandering. And you go and pound on all the doors of all the classrooms. And so, okay, that's not helpful. Now everybody's dysregulated. So then we said, that's not going to be an option for you because it doesn't regulate you. But then we found other things that would. Can we create regulation plans then, instead of behavior plans? It's like every kid has their own instruction manual about, each of us is different about what dysregulates us and what regulates us. That when we can be curious and we can figure this out, then we can figure out, oh, I can predict that that's going to be a hard day for him, so let's get in front of that with some regulation strategies, right? I know that this strategy works and this strategy doesn't. So when I see them starting to get upset, reading a book is great for some kids, and other kids it's going to go flying across the room. We learn that. And then we can support them in a different way. So this is our school, North Shore Academy. And, we doubled down on all sorts of things. So at Tier 1, we had a late start so the kids could get more sleep. I don't think kids got more sleep, actually. I think they just stayed up later, right? But you know who it had an impact on? I think staff were all more regulated because all of a sudden we had our meetings in the morning. We weren't fighting over the copier and the coffee machine. We weren't racing in and we didn't get our parking spot, and now we've got, or the snow is bad, right? And our team meetings were more productive because everybody was more regulated. And right away, and then we created regulation spaces instead of timeout spaces. We used zones of regulation. We implemented mindfulness. We had staff reflecting on their own dysregulation, and sure enough, incident reports went way down. Physical interventions went way down. Instead of saying, you need to go to the quiet room, if you don't, we're going to help you, we would say something like, how can we help you calm down so we can work this out together? It's a whole different message, isn't it? Right? And then the last piece is, we've got to remember that regulation, emotional regulation is developmental. And it's different for each of us, right? We each develop, this part of our brain develops at different points in time. You know, my son, he struggled mightily with executive functioning, right? And his sister, I'm telling you, like, she woke up, she was born, and I think in the womb, her prefrontal cortex was fully developed, right? Like she came out and she was ready to go. All this stuff about school comes easy to her. It didn't for Matthew, but you could see it getting better. He was a counselor at NSSRA. Are you guys familiar with NSSRA? It's so he was an inclusion aide for this camp, recreational programming in the summer. And the first summer as a sophomore, he showed up late every day. The next summer, he used to love to run around barefoot. He showed up on time every day, but he often forgot his shoes and had to go back. And then his senior year, he was Counselor of the Year. Can you see how each of these, it's just like watching it develop. And the same thing happened. I was worried to send him off to college. 500 detentions, right? 35% in your classes until the last week of school, right? And so I'm sitting there, so he went off to college, and he's graduating. And I'm sitting there looking at the brochure, and I don't see his name, like in the program. And I get there like an hour early, I get these seats, right? And I'm looking, and I can't find his name anywhere. And I'm like, are you kidding me? You didn't graduate, and you didn't tell us, right? And so then finally I find his name on the back under graduated students who graduated, one of the 25 kids who graduated with honors, right? It was hard for him until his brain caught up, right? And so here he is, a very different picture on graduation day in college. You know, Miles is a student, former student. He was probably our most aggressive student that we had as a freshman. We had to have Mike, who is our dean, be a one-to-one with him because we were so afraid that he was going to hurt other people because of his explosiveness, and it was constant. And we had plenty of meetings where it's like, I don't know if this is going to work. The mom asked us to hang on to him. We hung on to him for the rest of his high school. And he was less volatile as time went on, but he was still, even at his best, he was sullen, didn't really want to have much to do with anybody. He graduated in December of his senior year. And when he left, we all kind of breathed a sigh of relief. And I think he did too. We all liked him, but it was like, this is hard, and thank goodness we're not in this struggle anymore. And we had a lot of kids come back to visit NSA, and I'm like, yeah, well, that's the last we're going to see of Miles, right? He's not going to have anything to do with us. So you're going to be impressed by this. This is a little bit modest of me, but I was the assistant coach of my daughter's 4th grade basketball team. Huh? Not bad. And she's got her first game, and it's in early January. And we walk into the gym, and who's the referee? I did see him after all, and he's like, Bolton, now I got the whistle. And I was amazed to watch him work with these young girls. And he'd blow the whistle, and instead of having them turn it over, he'd say, no, this is how you dribble. This is how you pass the ball in, right? And when there was a timeout, he'd pick up the mop, and he was constantly mopping up the snow and things on the floor. And it was amazing to see how he was showing up. And a few years later, I ran into his mom, and his mom said, Miles would love to talk to you. I said, have him give me a call. And Miles did come and visit in his early 20s, and here he is visiting. And he says to me, just as we're finishing up his visit, and it was a great visit, and he says, "You think I could work here?" I'm like, oh man, I know too much about what it looks like when things don't go your way. And I'm thinking, so I said, I can get you an interview, but I'm not going to get you the job. So I got him an interview with the HR guy, and I'm like, you figure this out. I love Miles, but I don't know if this is a good idea. Well, he hired Miles for our elementary school. Well, so then he went, sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit. So Miles came in for the interview. And so here he is on interview day. And he's like, I dress just like you. So Miles, it's just a wonderful thing. He ends up working in our elementary school. And the thing about having struggles with dysregulation is you understand dysregulation at a very, very basic level. And there's nobody who was more regulated with the most dysregulated kids. Nobody who stepped into those situations and co-regulated as well as Miles did. It was beautiful. But it took him until he was about 25 to be able to do that, right? The thing is, it's hard to be patient. Anybody else make gravy at Thanksgiving? I hate making gravy at Thanksgiving because you're nodding your head like this is my experience. Anyways, is you put the butter and the flour in and you get it all going, then you pour the juices in, and it takes about 7 to 8 minutes to thicken. But every time it's about 5 minutes in and I'm like, this thing is not gonna thicken. I don't trust that it's gonna thicken, right? And then I just wanna start pouring flour in, and what would that do? It would totally ruin it, right? And I feel like this is what happens. We don't trust development in our kids. And so all of a sudden we're throwing flour on with all these punishments, all of these things that we say how frightened we are that they're not gonna have a future if they keep doing this, all of these things, right? We just need to be patient. Or as E.L. Doctorow says, our work is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. But here's the thing, every moment is a moment to help kids regulate. And it doesn't happen over, oh, this is my regulation strategy, okay, I'm gonna be regulated from now on. It doesn't work that way, but when we can continue to have them practice this regulation, when we can help regulate them and help them learn how to regulate, we can make the whole trip that way. So, let's get back to the chili story. So Michael leaves in handcuffs and yells, thanks for the fucking chili. And I knew exactly what he was talking about because his mom, we'd become very close to his mom because we spent a lot of time talking to her because Michael struggled in school. And his mom comes in one day and she says, I'm really scared and worried because I've just been diagnosed with breast cancer. I've got 4 kids, Michael's the oldest. And I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to support them. So our school created a meal train for him, and so parents and staff all got food and signed up. And the day before Michael was taken away in handcuffs, a parent brought in this huge thing of chili with cornbread. And just as before he gets on his bus, I see him and I say, come here, and I take him into the staff lounge. And I opened the door and I said, I'm going to deliver this to your house tonight. Check it out. And he looks, he's like, oh my gosh, my family's going to love this. And this whole thing for Michael was, I'm providing for my family, right? I'm doing my part. So Michael goes off. I sit down at my desk, and then I get a call from central office. I have to go and deal with a budget issue. And then I look at my watch as I'm sitting there, and I'm like, oh no. I've got to pick up my kids at their grandmother's house, and I'm late, so I hop in the car. I don't think about the chili one bit until Michael yells, thanks for the fucking chili. So we didn't have him arrested. We just wanted him safe, and his mom picked him up at the police station and brought him back. And he walks in like this, and I just said, I am so sorry. And he says, no, I'm so sorry. And he gave me a big hug. His mom said, we had so much food, I'm not sure why you even got so upset about that. We've got leftovers from all the other people. But it wasn't about that, was it? Right? So here's the thing. When we think about behavior and dysregulation, it doesn't mean we do nothing. I think people are worried, oh, we regulate kids and then they come back from the social worker's office with a lollipop and then they're done. That's not how it works, right? It means we do it differently. The key thing is keep our tools. Don't give up your incentive and punishment plans until you've got something to replace it with. Because otherwise everybody's dysregulated. At the very least, it's really nice to know you do this behavior, this is going to happen, and that regulates me as an adult. But I do think that the hope is that today and that we can begin developing new tools for our work, right? And that we'll have a different workshop that we can use to be able to support students and not rely on just those tools that we've known for years have been less effective. Or, as Anne Lamott says, almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you, right? So just take a minute. This is the kind of end of our emotional regulation piece. I want you to just take a minute and pause and think, what's one thing that you take away from this? And share that one thing with a partner. All right, now I'm going to ask you not to do an evaluation of me because we know this is the time of day that's so bad, but I will ask you all just to stand up and stretch. This is our own emotional regulation moment, so please just stand up and give it a stretch. We've got about 20 minutes left before lunch, but I want to make sure that you guys are regulated, and it's been a long morning of learning, so just get that blood moving a little bit. And then we'll get rolling. All right, thank you. So here is, I'd love to just dive in, and we'll get a little start to belonging in schools. But you know, the interesting thing for me is that I always believed in the power of community when I was a principal. But it was when I left being a principal that I started to really realize how essential this is for all of us. So I was a school psychologist, and this is my classroom when I was I think this is from the year 2000, when I was a school psychologist, and this is, we had about 12 kids in our class. And so it was my last day at North Shore Academy, and I'm packing up, and you've got all these cards and photos and things that have been at the bottom of drawers for years. And when I saw this photo, my eyes kind of, like I had so poignant a recognition of the importance of this group. And what I realized as I look at this, two kids jumped out at me. Brian, they both, Brian and Jordan, and they both seemed to be pretty similar on the surface, right? They both hated school. They both really struggled academically. They both were already substance using in middle school. They both were well known in by their local law enforcement people. And what I realized is that about 15 years after this picture was taken, I attended Brian's wedding, which was pretty cool. And about 3 years after this picture was taken, I gave the eulogy at Jordan's funeral. And as I thought about this, I realized that their stories aren't as similar as I thought they were. They were actually quite different. For Brian, he was with us from 6th grade to 12th grade. He drove us nuts, we drove him nuts, right? And he stayed with his mom drove him nuts, he drove her nuts, and yet everybody was kind of in it together. Jordan, on the other hand, was adopted at birth. His parents divorced. His mom remarried to somebody who really made it very clear he did not want Jordan in the house. That's when Jordan came to us as a middle schooler. Jordan ended up getting kicked out of their house, went to live with his dad and stepmom, had to move schools, got kicked out of that school, got kicked out of that school, and within 3 years he had died of a drug overdose. What I realized is that their stories were really different when it came to their experiences of belonging. And whereas I thought that belonging was just something that would help us be better and it's good for all of us, I realized that a lack of belonging for many kids can be fatal. And so I've really dove into figuring out how can we really understand and then harness the power of belonging. So it was a few years ago, my daughter gave me a Father's Day gift, and I didn't even know she could paint, but it's a pretty good picture, isn't it? But here's what she did. She defined community in this, and she says, community is the complicated, messy, beautiful fight to simply see each other. Isn't that good? Because here's the thing, as individuals, we're complicated and messy, aren't we? Like you put us together in classrooms and it gets really, in families, it gets really complicated and messy. And we've got to fight for it to be a healthy place. But when we do, there's nothing quite as beautiful as being a part of a belonging community. And it's, at the end of the day, it's simply about being able to see one another, being able to fully see each other and be seen, right? And the classroom is the child's first community. I saw this on the back of a bus. I think it was a preschool advertisement for a preschool program. But it's true, isn't it? That we learn who we are in community, in our classrooms, in our families, but in our classrooms. Nobody has kids for 40 hours, for 30 hours a week, for 40 weeks, for 13 years. This is where we learn. Do we have things? This is where we learn how to resolve conflicts. This is how we learn how to include people, how to be included. This is how we learn, do we matter? Do I have value here, right? And we've all been in communities where we've thrived. I hope we have. So I want you just to take a minute and think about a community where you thrived. A place that you just loved and felt loved. A place where you could be at your best, where you could be your authentic self. Everybody have one? And I want you to think about what made that special. We've been in lots of communities in our lives. What made that one stand out? So I want you to turn with a partner and just share, what was that community? And what made it so special? And I want to listen for those words, okay, about what made it so special. So take a couple minutes with a partner and share that with one another. I'd love to hear, raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you, but I'd love to just hear what some of the words are that showed up for you as you talked about this place where you could thrive.
Hi, Christina. I said my place was church and a belonging,
Yeah.
like home. And we had the discussion of it's very diverse with age and people, but yet we feel that connection.
Yeah, so and diversity can thrive in these places, right? Because
Absolutely.
everybody feels a sense of belonging, everybody feels a sense of home. Thank you. You guys were talking an awful lot and all of a sudden get quiet on us. What else? Yeah.
I was just thinking about my bachelor's program versus my master's program. And my master's program is where I felt I belonged because it was I totally forget about this, I'm sorry. Okay. Is this on? Is it on?
It's for the video.
The master's program was deafness rehab counseling, and I was among my people, like my tribe. And the bachelor's program, large school, hearing.
You're right.
I just didn't, there's a sense of being accepted and being authentic when you're among your tribe.
Yeah, I love that term tribe. There's a book that I'm going to reference called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, and I love that book. And what it does is it really speaks to, we can show up as we are, and we're going to be accepted for who we are, right? I love that. And the other thing about a master's program that people often talk about is there's this sense of common purpose. Right? We're in this, we're diving deep into this for, it can be for worship. We're in this to be able to learn how we can become the best clinicians we can become, or whatever that may be. Love it. Who else? Yeah, we got two.
I think the first or a big community for me was when I was playing soccer in college. So it was my soccer team. I think it was the first community where I felt you could express yourself fully, which is vulnerable, and you could also conflict safely. And I know it's not like that for everybody, but for my experience, it was where problem solving occurred. you hurt people's feelings and you responded and you worked through that because you kind of have to, or it affects how you play. So it was, I had a really beautiful experience.
I love that because these places aren't without conflict, right? In fact, it's almost the conflict that helps us come together when it can be healthy, right? And that we can fully express ourselves and not feel like we need to hold back. That it's got that level of safety. Love that. Thank you. Let's do one more.
One of my first teaching jobs, I was hours and hours from home. So the supervisor and the lead teacher kind of took me in. I lived with one of their neighbors, but it was very sense of community because I could fail and they would walk me through how to do it better next time. So there wasn't the fear of being looked down upon, but as a learning experience.
Love that. So this idea that when we struggle, I love the two themes, that we can struggle in these places, right, and still be seen as valuable, be seen as this is part of my journey of learning. It's not because I'm a failure as a teacher or whatever that may be. And also, really seeing you, that you're traveling all this way. Let's figure out how we can take care of you that way. I love that. You know, it's interesting. They say that the research says that even thinking about places like this can quiet our nervous system. That our breathing can change thinking about these places, right? And that's why I hate to do this to you, because the opposite is also true, isn't it? We've been in these places too, haven't we? So I'd love for you to do the same thing. I won't give you as much time because I don't want you to dwell in this too much. But I think it's important that we take a look and see what are those places like as well. So what was the place and what made it so toxic and unhealthy for you? All right, let's do the same thing with this toxic place. What are some of the words that showed up for you in this toxic place? Yeah. Oh. Negativity? Yeah.
I have one that, I don't know if is this working, this mic? I don't know. Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm like, I talk loud anyway. So when I was in college, I studied with the visually impaired program, and unfortunately, there were a couple professors there that were kind of discriminatory to some of my classmates. Like they, bad grades for no reason, or if they were going sighted guy with someone where they hold your arm, it's like, well, why aren't they using their cane? And that's kind of stuck with me for years, that they didn't even want to be in the program anymore. It was just really sad, especially within our own field.
Well, it's interesting. There's poor leadership, right? That there's that poor leadership, but there's this lack of engagement and investment and feeling like I think of it's almost unethical, right? Is the word that comes to me. That may be, but that's that this being led by people who you don't respect, who's really hard.
Vision loss than someone with vision loss, in my opinion.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you. What else? Yeah, we got another one? Yeah.
I would say miscommunication.
Mm-hmm.
Not wanting to work through communication breakdown.
Yeah. Well, oftentimes there's bad communication, but then when there's poor communication, it falls on us, that it's our fault that something went wrong. It's not that it was poorly communicated. There's something that I did wrong, or there's some problem with me, that can be really problematic. Thank you. Exactly. I'll get you right here.
I was going to just say that different moral, ambitious compass, the group that I was with were not as ambitious as I was, and it was just kind of dragging me down.
Yeah.
So it's just different morals and different values, I guess.
Absolutely. When we don't feel
Repeat that for us in the
Yeah, different morals and different values, that it can drag you down when you're in a place that's not consistent with what we believe the work should be. I hope I'm doing this credit, what we believe the work should be, what we believe it should be founded in, right? It does remind me a little bit of the poor leadership piece. It's like, oh, this is not, I don't fit here. Because at some very basic level, we're not doing the right work, right? So, it's interesting. You can't read this, and that's okay, because my spelling and handwriting is terrible, okay? But I'll just put these up anyways. Because I think one of the interesting things about the research on schools is that schools have always been places of both thriving and harm. And the interesting thing about the research is that it's not like we have belonging classrooms and othering classrooms. The research says there's more variability within each classroom than there is between classrooms. So in every school and every classroom, we're going to have kids coming in who are going to experience this as a more toxic place, even though some kids are experiencing it as a thriving place. And our community has a huge impact on how we act, doesn't it? So did you act any differently in this space than you did in that space? Right? So the community has this huge impact. There's I like Lewin's equation, which is behavior is a function of the person and his or her environment, right? It's not just the person. And so often when kids are struggling, we think, oh, how are we going to change that person? And yet so much of the work is figuring out, well, what are we embedding them in? What's the community we're embedding them in? Nicholas Christakis, who's done a lot of research on this, he says personality traits such as kindness people often think the personality traits such as kindness are fixed, but our research with groups suggests something quite different. The tendency to be altruistic or exploitative can depend heavily on how the social world is organized. So if we take one group of kids and we put them in one group, we put them in one classroom, they can be really kind and generous to one another. We take the same student and put them in another place, and they can become really mean or indifferent to one another. What he says is, crucially, this indicates that the tendency to cooperate is a property not only of individuals, but of groups. So in the 1760s, I think America had a lot of problems. I'm going to talk about one, and that is that we had Europeans coming into America and pushing into Ohio, pushing into Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and taking native lands. And of course, the native communities fought back, and there were wars, and they would take hostages and prisoners. And then when the wars were done, they would let the prisoners go back. Now this is where it got interesting. A French journalist in the 1700s said, thousands of Europeans chose to stay with the Indians. But we have not even one example of one of those Indians choosing to become European. There must be in their social bond something singularly captivating and far superior to anything that we can be boasted of among us. So Benjamin Franklin writes about this, right? So Sebastian Junger, in his book Tribe, I love that word, says, the intensely communal nature of an Indian tribe held an appeal that material benefits of Western civilization just couldn't compete with. How much would I have to pay you to go back to that place that was toxic? Yeah, most people would say you couldn't pay me, right? And so at the core of our being is to belong, and I think education has changed a lot when it comes to belonging in the last 25 years or so. And I'm not here to beat up on NCLB. I think that it was well-meaning, I really do, and I think it was misguided for a lot of reasons. And the data is showing that, but it's at the basic level, it says, we're gonna hold people accountable for test scores. And that's good, and that's how we're gonna measure learning, and we're gonna hold people accountable if those test scores don't go up. And I think something insidious began to happen in our schools, and that is we went from figuring out how do we develop really good people to how do we develop really good data. And Goodhart's law, I like this, says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And I think that's what's happened in our schools. What we know is that focusing on test scores didn't work. The number of schools failing to make AYP leapt. It didn't go down in the heart of NCLB. And in fact, when we take a look at after all that we've invested right? In being able to have this rigorous curriculum and all this testing and everything else we've done. In 2000, our OECD score for reading was a 504. And there it is, 2022, 504. Math actually went down, right, in that time. So it didn't work. But in the meantime, there were some unintended consequences. Everyone is stressed in schools in ways that didn't exist before. Staff are experiencing unprecedented stress. There's a Gallup poll, and every year they measure the most stressful professions. K-12 teachers report the highest levels of stress of any profession in America. And you guys are on the front lines of this. Students are hurting in unprecedented ways. There's a mental health crisis. There's an epidemic, right? And this existed long before the pandemic. If we take a look at the decade before the pandemic, rates of depression rose more than 60% in kids. The number of kids seen in emergency rooms with suicidal thoughts or attempts doubled in that decade. These are huge numbers. And then, the suicide rate for children is 2 times higher when school is in session. This is the one, as an educator, that really got me. It's not about the weather, because for adults, it's higher in the summer. When I saw this graph, I couldn't unsee it. So this is mental health emergency room visits by week for 2019 for kids aged 5 to 17. Take a look. Look at how low it is. This is the week ending January 5th. What's that? Winter break. Look at how it skyrockets once we go back to school, peaking right around May 11th. What's that? Finals week for a lot of places. Look at how it plummets during the summer, and it skyrockets again in August. This is the one that really gets me. Just having 3 days off for Thanksgiving. Take a look at the impact. Then it goes right back up and plummets again. I can't look at this and not realize that we in schools are pushing many kids to the very edge of their ability to cope, and for some of them beyond that. And then, also in 2019, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did this research. Students in high-achieving schools are now named an at-risk group. The schools that we thought were the most protective, the schools where people will mortgage their lives so their kids can get into these high-achieving schools, now just attending a high-achieving school puts you at risk for emotional behavioral problems. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation named the top environmental conditions harming adolescent wellness. And we knew about the first 3, poverty, trauma, discrimination. But here it is, this excessive pressure to excel. Children in high-achieving schools suffer significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, at least 3 to 7 times the national average. You know, if this was an issue, all of these things were happening because the water in the pipes was causing this, we would close school, we would dig up the pipes, we would spare no expense. And yet, we're all a part of this system. Parents, kids, educators, teachers, administrators, school boards, community members. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. As an educator, this is humbling for me because I'm a part of that system. But also, as an educator, it's inspiring to me because I realize I can help change this for the kids, families, and staff I work with. You know, I guess I want to be very clear, this is not an anti-data talk. We need data. We need to be able to track data. Data is essential. The question is, how do we use that data? The focus on the numbers often comes at the cost of time to connect, and yet it's the connection that drives the numbers. Learning has always been social. And what happens is when we teach bell to bell, we don't allow those natural connections to happen. We become much more a place that feels toxic than a place where we can thrive. It's almost like this, you know, here's this guy with 2 wheels on this cart with square wheels, right? No thanks, we're too busy to put those round wheels on. We don't have time to do that stuff. And yet what we know is if we want kids' brains to come alive, we need to be connected in relationship. So I want you to take a minute and share your thoughts about how the stress of school is impacting your work, the students you serve, the families you serve, right? So take a couple minutes just to share that with one another. And then we'll break out of that and we'll go to lunch. All right, welcome back. Anybody else just realize that potatoes are a sedative? I just want nap time right now. That was so good. Here's what I want you to do just to start off. I want to start off the way we did last time, is just take a minute. You don't have to do any special breathing or anything, but just notice the kind of energy you're bringing in. Where's your brain bank account this afternoon? And share that with a partner, just to get your voice in the room and to just beginning to think about what is it that we're bringing for the rest of the next hour and a half together. So take a couple minutes to do that. All right, so I want to start this afternoon with a public health parable. And I think it's a parable that's also a metaphor for our mental health crisis. So there are these two people sitting by the river having a nice picnic, and they look up and they see a child drowning in the water. And they dive in and they get this child out of water, and they're exhausted. They look up and there are two more kids in the water needing their help. They dive back in and they pull those kids to safety. And then they look up and the river is filled with these kids. And one of them dives back in and starts pulling kids out as fast as he can. And the other one goes up on shore. And the one in the water says, "What are you doing? I can't save these kids on my own." And the one on shore says, "I'm going upstream. I need to figure out why these kids are falling in. That's where we've got to help them." And so this afternoon, I really want to begin to look upstream. And I want to look upstream and talk about the power of belonging as an upstream intervention for just about everything that we're struggling with in our schools. So at the core of education is to belong. So what is belonging? You guys named it really beautifully, but it's at its basic level, it's the feeling that we're part of a larger group that values, respects, and cares for us. And we've got something to contribute. We matter here, right? So why is belonging so important? Belonging does two really important things. The first thing it does is it opens our brains up for learning. I want you to think about what are the stresses that are happening in our schools today, and I think belonging is upstream for all of them. Take a look. Students who experience belonging, they're more motivated to learn, they perform better academically, they have better attendance, they engage in less misconduct, they're healthier, they have higher self-esteem, better mental health. How is this not the first thing we're talking about in schools, right? Given the power that it has to transform and to engage kids. And it buffers the impact of stress and trauma. They looked at 12,000 kids and found the most powerful protective factor for every form of adolescent risk behavior, emotional distress, drug abuse, violence, and suicidality. Two things: their sense of belonging at school and their sense of belonging at home. And there may not be as much we can do about home, but there's a lot we can do about school, because we've got these kids more than any other community has these kids. We've got them for 30 hours a week. Nobody has kids for 30 hours a week. But here's the thing, our schools have a belonging problem. They took a look at an international study, 32,000 students, 12 countries. USA was last in belonging. And belonging in high school, only 51% of kids say they experience this. And it's not just in the US. Belonging in schools has been declining internationally for a decade. So the thing I love about this belonging work is that we've got all the resources we need, don't we? We just need people. And we've got people. We've got kids who come in who are wanting to connect. We've got adults who chose a profession because they care about kids. We've got what it takes. But the thing that we often get wrong is we believe that, oh, if we put it in our strategic plan, it happens. Oh, if we put a banner on the wall saying everybody's welcome here, then you suddenly feel like you're welcome, right? Anybody have that experience that in that toxic place, people talked about how what a crazy, we're all family here, and it's like, not my family, or this is not a healthy family for me. We belong here. They've got the banners. And yet it's not our experience, right? See, belonging doesn't happen just because we say it happens. It doesn't happen in a belonging week at the very first week of the school year, right? Belonging happens in an infinite number of cues that we get throughout our day. And when we think about these cues, I also want to think about the brain balance. It's the same thing we're talking about. Belonging cues are like a quick deposit in our brain banks. And we perceive these cues within the blink of an eye. We are wired to see when we walk into a space, are we wanted? Are we valued here? Jeffrey Cohen, who summarized the research on this, he says, even fleeting experiences of belonging can have far-reaching benefits. They raise our sense of self-being and self-worth, improve our performance, they lessen our defensiveness and hostility, they increase our tolerance of outsiders, they make us more compassionate. It is a condition for us to be successful. These small moments make a big difference. When someone's face lights up, right? We used to, when you walk home and your 4-year-old or 3-year-old comes running up and wants a huge hug, right? I had the problem that my kid's grandmother my mother-in-law was just too good with the kid. So like I always imagined this kid coming and running and giving me a big hug, but he'd come flying around the corner, he'd see I was home. That meant grandma was having to leave, and he'd just fall on the ground and cry. I'd be like, this is not how it's supposed to work. But here's the other thing. When our sense of belonging is threatened, even momentarily, we're more likely to feel worse about ourselves, perform below our potential, behave impulsively, see others as hostile, and lash out defensively. That these small moments can make a big difference. How about if you're sitting in a team meeting and you say something, you finally have the courage to say something and you see someone roll their eyes? What does that do for the rest of your participation in that space, right? And the thing about kids with any kind of disability or impairment is that they are so much less likely to get these belonging cues from other people. This is what I experienced at North Shore Academy, is it's just so much harder our work is to take these kids who experience, when the core of our work, the core of a school doesn't fit everybody. And for the kids, it doesn't fit naturally. They're the ones who are constantly receiving subtle and sometimes not so subtle othering cues. And these othering cues create something called belonging uncertainty. And this belonging uncertainty undermines everything that we're trying to do in our schools. So let me introduce you to Brene Brown. I'm sure no one's ever heard of Brene Brown, but she's I'm kidding. She's so, this is her work though, isn't it? Brene Brown. A deep sense of love and belonging is an irreducible need of all people. And this is the piece that I think is important, is this is a need. We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love and to be loved and to belong. When those needs are not met, we don't function as we're meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we get sick, we hurt others. And the thing is that the kids who struggle the most get the fewest belonging cues. They're the ones who feel like they don't belong. And if we don't create belonging for students in school, they're going to find it. That's the thing. They're going to find it in ways that are really distressing for us, right? They're going to find it in substance use. They're going to find it in delinquent activities. They're going to find it online. They're going to find it not being able to leave the basement because that's the place where their community is. Or as Susie Wise says, belonging is the key that unlocks the best in all of us. So this is essential for us, right? And then, so this is, I find this really helpful. This is how Castle talks about how to implement systemic SEL. We start with a foundation and a plan, right? But number 3 is supporting SEL for students. What comes second? It's strengthening adult SEL. And the same thing is true for belonging. It's almost impossible to create belonging for our students if we don't feel a sense of belonging ourselves. It's just so hard. So all of this, everything we're going to talk about, isn't just about our students, it's about our colleagues. It's about how we create this for one another as much as how we create it for kids. So I guess I'd love for you just to take a minute and just share your thoughts about belonging and what this research says about belonging. And then what I want to do is I want to dive in and we're going to talk about 6 specific strategies for how to do that. But first, just anything about this research surprise you, you question about, whatever it may be, but just reflect on the research on belonging as a whole. And then we'll get into some very specific ways that we can do that. All right, let's dive into some strategies. Here's what my hope is that these are strategies, for the most part, that we could just even apply tomorrow if we wanted to. So there's an intentionality about it, but this is my hope. And the first is creating welcoming rituals. Susie Wise says, belonging begins with an invitation into a space. How do we invite kids into our spaces? How do we invite one another into our spaces? So Mary Jo Barrett, she is anybody here know Mary Jo Barrett? She is a local clinician. She's out of Skokie, but she's world renowned for her work in working with kids who've experienced trauma and families who've experienced trauma. And she's got a collaborative change model. And what I think that this collaborative change model that she has for working with families can also really apply to our work in our classrooms. And I love a theory that's simple. And I don't think it gets much more simple than this, that everything we do has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And our work is to honor all of those. So if we talk about classrooms, the first thing we've got to do is create the context for learning. How do we create the context for learning? And then we do the learning, and then we consolidate that learning. Right? We figure out, okay, let's reflect on what we've learned. How's it going to apply for tomorrow? How are we going to apply it to our general lives, right? But here's the thing. When we teach bell to bell, we're really only focusing on stage 2. And we lose stage 1 and stage 3. And what I want to say is creating the context for the learning is just as important as the learning. In fact, that's what drives the learning. When we think about creating the context, I think about Thanksgiving. How many weeks or months before Thanksgiving do we start planning Thanksgiving? We got to figure out, we may be figuring out now who's going to stay with who for Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving at this place, Christmas at that place, Hanukkah at this place, whatever it may be. But we're constantly figuring out where we're going to be for these vacations. And then we're figuring out where we're going to stay. Then the weeks before, we figure out who's bringing what. And then the weekend before, we're shopping and we're getting everything ready. The week before, we're pre-cooking. The day of, we're cleaning, we're setting the table, we're finalizing the cooking, and we sit down at the table. And how long does it take before we finish eating it? An hour, maybe? Right? I guess what I would say is we know that it takes a lot to create the experience of Thanksgiving, to be able to make the most of that moment together. I wonder if we could take the same energy and put it into how do we create the context for our kids in our classrooms, because welcoming rituals create the context for belonging. So why rituals? Because rituals reduce stress. When we know it's coming, then it's less stressful, right? Rituals also communicate values. We have rituals around things that are valuable to us. Right? We value our teeth, so we have a ritual of brushing our teeth a couple times a day. We have rituals about how kids line up because we don't run running through the hallways. We got rituals for where to put your homework, right? Do we have rituals for how we welcome people into our spaces? Because it's these rituals that create the culture. Michael Norton says, rituals are culture in action. So every day we are welcoming and inviting students into this unique community of learning and discovery. How are we doing that? So I want you to think about a couple things. The first is the place. What's the first thing a student sees when they walk into your office or your classroom? How does seating invite connection? What do you have on the smart board and on your walls? When you post things, are they warning or are they welcoming? Our library shelves, our displays, our books are always talking. What message are they sending about who's included and welcome in our space and who isn't? And entering a space also sets the stage for what's going to follow. When I walk into this space, I feel something very different and have different expectations than when I walk into this space. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'd rather take a test in this space, and I'd rather be in classroom in this space, right? But it primes us when we walk in, doesn't it? Entering a space also means entering the story of that space, the characters, the rules, and the history. People know about what the third grade teacher is like. All the second graders know a little bit of what the history is for the third graders and what people's experience is for each classroom. I had a former NSA student, and she was a school refuser. She felt alienated from her school community, and we finally got her back to high school after she really struggled in middle school. And she ended up making it back to New Trier High School, and then she went on to get her degree in education. And now she's a fourth grade teacher in the same school where she was a fourth grade student. And just like Miles understood regulation, she understood belonging, because it's something that she really struggled with early on. And so I go to visit her classroom, and there's not a better SEL classroom than her classroom. It's kind of remarkable to watch the magic that she creates. But she posted this. This is her classroom, the first day of fourth grade for her students. This is what they walk into. So there's a lot of little cues around here, right? There's going to be times when we can just sit and hang out. We value books because there are all these books here. We're going to be working in groups and teams, right? But then I love this a little bit up closer, right? Here it is, class family. We're going to get to know each other's names early. And there's a cue that it's going to feel like a family in here. And then this, let the adventure begin. It's going to be exciting and hard in here, right? And then down here, welcome to fourth grade. In this brochure, I will give you some survival tips for the fourth grade. I know it's going to be hard, I see you. All of these cues, right? And so that's the space, but what's the process? Are we at the door, at the computer when students walk in? How do we greet students? How do students connect to one another? Is there a group activity, or are they supposed to do something independently? Are you guys familiar with the greeting at the door data? It's fascinating. When we greet kids at the door, right? And it doesn't have to be long. And I'm not talking about the different handshake or dance with every kid, right? That's nice for TikTok videos, but I'm not sure if that's really what the spirit is. But when we greet kids at the door, when we make some sort of interpersonal, verbal or nonverbal connection with them, academic engagement increases by 20%. That's 12 minutes per instructional hour. That's an hour additional instruction per day. And disruptive behavior decreases by 70%. You know, it's interesting when I think about this, what we're doing is we're sending a belonging cue, which we know opens our brains up for learning. That's number one. But also, when we're making eye contact, when we're connecting with kids, they're judging our emotional regulation, and we're judging theirs, aren't we? And then we can get in front of those things. It's regulating, and it allows us to say, oh, this group is a little squirrely. I'm going to get in front of that, right? And it's not just true for our kids. It's true for our teams. How do we welcome each other into our team meetings? When parents come in, how do we welcome parents into our spaces? You know, parent-teacher conferences, it's like you got 5 minutes and they're always 15 minutes behind, right? And so all of a sudden you're just rushing through. And what teachers want to do is we want to give them all the data. But we can get the data on the portal. As parents, what do we really want to know? Do you care about my kid? And how do I know that? Because you show that you care about me. You see me. There are lots of paths to the same destination. What's your path? The thing is, each of us needs to be intentional. And so as we think about how do we do welcoming rituals, the next step is, I think we incorporate this next step into those welcoming rituals, which is the 3 R's. So Bruce Perry, an expert on trauma and neuroscience, is the one who really talks about these 3 R's. That we need to be emotionally regulated and we need to be connected in relationship in order to access our best brains, period. If we're not regulated, we're not connected, we can't be our best selves. And I love when theories dovetail. Take a look at how this dovetails with social-emotional learning. So the competency wheel, we've got self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. With the 3 R's, regulation is all about self-awareness and self-management, right? When we talk about relationships, we're talking about social awareness. And do we have the skills in those moments and building the skills to be able to be completely related? And then reason is just a synonym for responsible decision making. We're talking about the same thing. I find the 3 R's easier to remember than the competency wheel, right? But at the end of the day, kids and we are walking in with all sorts of things that are happening at home, happening in the hallway, happening in our lives, happening in our country, right? And what we want to do is kind of open that up, quiet that all down so we can be available for instruction. And you don't need to be the Dalai Lama. I'm terrible at these things, but I led you in the mindfulness activity, just a little something, right? All we want to do is give our nervous system a chance to quiet down. And the research on this is robust. Stress, anxiety, and conflict are reduced significantly when we just do a little bit of mindfulness, and attention, regulation, concentration, achievement, compassion, and empathy all go up. But how often are we seeing, given that this research has been around for decades and is robust, how often do we see it happening in classrooms? I almost never see it. And it's not just good for kids. Adults benefit from it too. Educators who incorporate mindfulness into their teaching practices report reduced stress, increased emotional resilience, and greater job satisfaction. Why? Because we all need this. And this is how we connect in relationship. My goal, if I was a teacher, my goal would be for every classroom, do they know something more about someone else after each class? And it doesn't have to be any deep, dark secrets. I had a principal who I was doing this with, and he said, I wish that I had thought about this before because I was a math teacher, and I would say, hey, why don't you take a look, check your work with my work on the board. But if I had said, why don't you just check your work with the person next to you or behind you, all of a sudden, you learn something about them. You see the sticker of a band that you love on their backpack, and you go, I love that band too. And then when you see each other in the hallway, there's going to be a belonging cue, or in the lunchroom, right? Or I love that pencil you've got, or whatever it may be, but all of a sudden we know something a little bit more about each other. And this is from another class, this is from a therapeutic school, but let's say this is 24 kids per classroom, 8 class periods a day, 180 days. Imagine the kinds of connections we can make. And it doesn't have to take very long. And this is how we access our best brains. That's why I start everything with quieting our nervous system and then just connecting you guys with one another. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. I don't care if you're talking about your zones or you're talking about how hard the commute was. Typically when we talk about our zones, there's a story behind it. We get to know each other a little bit more that way. But take a look. What zone are you in? What do you need? What zone are you in? Self-awareness. What do you need? Self-management. You're listening to someone else and you're aware of what they're going through. And every time we interact with someone, we're building skills. In 90 seconds, we were able to embed an SEL lesson this way, right? So the thing that we've got to remember is academic achievement always requires regulation and relationships. And if we depart from that, kids won't learn in the same way. When we depart from that, we lose the ability to be creating these spaces where we thrive. So take a minute and just think, what welcoming rituals do you use? And if you don't have welcoming rituals, if you're not intentional about it, think about it. Like, how might I welcome students into my space, into my work, into my classroom? What does that look like? So take a minute with one another and share that with each other. What is your welcoming ritual? All right. Oops, sorry, I cut you off guard. All right, so the next one is create psychological safety. The research, there's been a lot of research on psychological safety, but the one that jumps out comes from a pretty surprising place, and that is Google. Who would have thought that Google was a place that would be teaching us about psychological safety? And yet, they weren't meaning to. In their Project Aristotle, what they were trying to do is figure out what makes teams effective. And it happened to be that psychological safety came to the top, unexpected to them, right? So what they did was they took a look at 180 teams over 3 years, and they watched their meetings. They saw how productive they were. They got ratings on how much people appreciated being a part of those meetings. And what they found is that great teams had 2 qualities. And the first is equal airtime. Everybody's voice matters here. Everybody has the same amount of talking time. And not every meeting, but over the course of the 3 years, everybody spoke about the same amount of time. What they said is that when everybody's voice doesn't get in the room, then the average intelligence of the group goes down. The second is attunement. This idea that we know each other well enough to be able to, we know each other that we can look at them and say, oh, you don't like that idea, right? We recognize what their facial expressions. But not just that. It's also about knowing what their story is outside of here, right? If there's a colleague I've been on a team with for 10 years, and they're always volunteering, always the first person to jump in, but all of a sudden, they're leaving right at 3:30 when the bell rings, and they're not volunteering for anything, and what am I thinking? I'm thinking they're checking out, right? They don't care as much about teaching. That's maybe what I would think until I realized that they had a parent at home who was in memory care, and they needed to get home to have their day worker leave at 3:30. Otherwise, their parent would be more vulnerable. Then all of a sudden, the story changes for us, doesn't it? But is it safe for us to tell these stories to one another on our teams? You know, Amy Edmondson says psychological safety, she's the one who coined the term. She says psychological safety is really three things. This idea that it's safe to take a risk in here. That if I'm a fourth grader and I try a hard reading passage and I stumble over it, I'm not going to hear snickers in the back. I'm not going to be teased about it on the playground. If I'm a new teacher and I have an idea that's different from what everybody else thinks, I'm not going to be going outside and seeing everybody talking about me in the parking lot or people huddling behind closed doors, right? And it's a team climate where I can trust that I can truly be myself. And you guys really got at that here. We can really be ourselves. We can be seen and heard, and we can see others and hear others. And you know, that's why I love this, because I think that when and it doesn't have to be zones, but this idea that we get everybody's voice in the room to start the day. I don't need to hear everybody's voice. The question is, can everybody's voice get in the room? Not as a teacher, can I hear it all, right? And then I'll get to know one another better as I hear their regulation stories, their zone stories. Anybody hear of classroom network mapping? Where you track kids and relationships and kids. You ask kids, who are you connected to in the classroom? And then they write down who are these connections, and you can graphically represent kind of the nature, the culture of the classroom about who's connected and who's left out. And so I was talking to an elementary school psychologist, and she said, I want you to take a look at a couple of these classroom maps, 2 classrooms, both kindergarten classrooms right next to each other, and yet their maps look totally different. I'm like, well, let me take a look at them. She says, well, here's one map. So each of these dots represents a student, and each of these arrows means that these are kids who endorsed one another, right? And so look at how few connections there are in this classroom. And so I said, what does the other classroom look like? Take a look. What a difference, right? Same resources, same hallway, same schedule, same supervisor. This teacher's doing something different, right? And of course, it's kindergarten, so you got boys and you got girls, right? And you got one couple in the middle that's holding the whole classroom together, but, right? But this is the power of being able to make sure that we are intentionally trying to figure out, how do we create these environments? And then strategy number 4 is, can we pause and ponder? So Mary Jo Baird, who I mentioned earlier, who's the voice of how do we support people who've experienced trauma. I was asked after the Highland Park shooting to come in and work with the teachers who were coming back after experiencing their own trauma that day. And then how do they figure out, how do we welcome kids back who've experienced direct trauma? Some of these kids had been shot themselves, family members, or people who weren't there, but the collective trauma of the community. It was powerful. So I'm smart enough to know that I needed support with that. And I brought Mary Jo in. And I learned more about trauma that day than I think anybody else in the room. And what she said that is so helpful for me, and I think helpful for us when we think about kids in our schools, is that our bodies, our lives have a rhythm, and that rhythm is essential. That what we do is our nervous system has a rhythm. And so our nervous system, as we engage and we're working a full workday and we're working hard, right? And then we sleep at night and we rest. Maybe we watch a show, maybe we read a book, we rest, right? Quieting that nervous system. And then the next day, we work a full work week and then we have a weekend. That these rhythms are predictable and these rhythms happen, right? That we play a first half of a sports game, in sports, and then we have halftime, and then we have a second half, and then we have a break. That these rhythms are essential. And what she says is that when any of us experience trauma, what trauma does is it takes away the rhythm. What trauma does is it takes our nervous system and it's constantly active. It's essential that our nervous systems expand and contract, and that we need to contract in order to expand. In order to be our best selves on a given day, we need to have a good night's sleep the night before, right? That this is what's essential. When we teach bell to bell, when we have kids who are moving from school to after-school programming, we've taken away a lot of the pauses. And she says what we need to do is we need to pause. We need to ponder. We need to quiet the nervous system in regular doses so that we can be our best selves, our healthiest selves. There's a dog musher in Alaska who wrote this article that I loved, and she said, when I strap my dogs into their harnesses, they just want to run for 40 miles. And they would just run, and then they'd collapse. She says, but our races are 500 miles long, and some of our races, the Iditarod is over 1,000 miles long. She said, so what do? She said, so we run hard for 4 hours, and no matter how we feel after that 4 hours, we stop for 2, and we rest, and we eat, and we get warm, and we care for each other. And then we run for another 4, and we rest for 2, and run for 4, rest for 2. She says, we can run forever that way. These breaks are essential. They took a look at, Microsoft took a look at different brains. So these brains went from meeting to meeting without a break. So the greens and the blues are regulated brains, the yellows and the orange are dysregulated brains. So meeting 1, we start off okay. But by meeting 2, look at, right? Period 1, period 2, right? IEP meeting 1, IEP meeting 2, IEP meeting 3, right? Well, what happens if we put a 10-minute break in there? We can run forever that way. But we don't put that break in. When we take a look, how does that impact students' learning? Well, you take a look, students with fresh brains, 8 a.m., they gave kids the same test in Denmark, 2 million kids the same test, and they took a look at how the test scores varied by time of day. It progressively goes down. But take a look, there's a bump here. There's a bump between 11 and 12. This may not look like much, but it's as if this group got 3 weeks of additional instruction compared to this group. That's a lot. So how do we get that bump? Those kids got a 10-minute break, movement, social break. It opens our brains up for learning. So how much of a break do we need, right? So in recess, in the 80s and 90s, kids were getting 45 to 60 minutes of recess. And now they're getting 20 to 30 minutes if they're lucky. Does that make a difference? So they took a look and they compared kids who got 30 minutes of recess versus 45 minutes of recess. And it's shocking to me. Students with 45 minutes of recess had 68% less cortisol in their brains. 68% less of the stress hormone. That means their nervous system is significantly quieter, right? What kind of breaks do kids need during a class period? So in high school, we've got these block schedules, right? So they did, it's interesting, this is a college study, but they looked at college lectures. For an hour-and-a-half lectures, they gave 2 conditions. One is a 10-minute break in the middle, and the other is a 90-second break, micro break every 10 minutes. And what they found, and so these micro breaks were just casual. They were like you could close your eyes, get a drink of water, turn and talk, stretch, whatever it may be, right? Just a brief moment. And here's what they found. The micro break group outperformed the single break group by 76%. Our brains need this rhythm. That's why I try and do a turn and talk every 15 minutes or so. I don't quite get it down to 10 minutes, but every 15 minutes, right? And that's why you guys had a couple of longer breaks. What we need to do, the researchers say, educators need to acknowledge the three, essentially, educators need to make our lessons, we need to structure our work in ways that are compatible with kids' brains. Nobody's brain is meant to sit and listen for that long. But here's the thing, children's lives have been expanding but not contracting. In school, you've got, you're teaching bell to bell, and then at least in middle school, how long? In middle school, you've got a 2 to 4 minute passing period. And then you go right back in it, right? That's not enough time for teachers, it's not enough time for students, right? And then they get out of school and they've got to go to, they're on 3 travel teams. So they've got to go to indoor soccer. And then they've got to go to their piano lessons. And then, of course, they got to go to their therapist, right? Because it's too much for them, right? And as a parent, you've got 3 kids with 3 travel teams. And you're not getting it the time you need either. They looked at kids' sleep. Kids in 1980 were getting an hour more sleep than kids in 2010. And that's before smartphones went into kids' bedrooms, right? And this makes a huge difference when we think about what's upstream of our mental health crisis. Sleep is a huge part of it. ADHD, obesity, behavior problems, academics, and social skills all go way up. But here's the thing. This is what we say, is this is just the cost of academic rigor, right? This is, if we want our kids to be successful and we want to have high quality education, this is the cost. And the benefit is going to show up later. Well, here's the thing. In Finland, teachers and students have an hour more break time per school day compared to the US. And for homework, kids in Finland have 2.9 hours per week. In the United States, it's 2.7 hours per night. Compared to Finland, American students work 21 hours more per week and at home. That's a part-time job. So we must be getting better test scores, right? We're still behind. And Finland used to be number 1, but for a lot of reasons, their number has dropped, but we're still behind, right? In education, we continue to add. What if we didn't teach bell to bell? What can we subtract? How can we create a pause? Not just for students, but for ourselves. So I guess in every class, what I'd love to think about is, can we have a welcoming ritual? Can we make sure that kids have a moment to connect and regulate? Can we get everybody's voice in the room? Can we be attuned to one another and have that be a focus of what we're doing? Can we know something more about one another at the end of every class? And then can we take the time we need to pause and ponder? So take a minute. How can you plan your classes or your work so that there's a pause and a time to connect throughout each lesson? How might you put the pause in? And I'm fine if you say, I need to put a pause into my life, right? I haven't had a lunch in 3 years, right? How am I going to put a pause in for me so I can show up? So use this to talk about how you do it in your work or how you do it in your own life. So take a couple minutes. How do we create those pauses? All right. I decided to sneak in one more strategy. It's one of my favorites, and I wasn't sure we could do it, but so this one is not in your slides. I'll get those to you, but just take really good notes if you're taking notes. But just sit back and enjoy this, because I think it's an important one. And that is communicating high expectations. And the work for this, because there's nothing that quite lets us feel like we belong as when we know people believe in us. So the research about this, one of my favorite studies is a rat study. And this guy, Robert Rosenthal, was wondering, could our expectations change, could our expectations of a rat change how that rat moves through a maze? So what he did was he named rats smart and dull. It says dumb here, it's smart and dull. And what he did was he just randomly assigned these rats to different conditions, to either one. He didn't do a cognitive test on all these rats. And he had a series of research assistants, and he gave each research assistant a rat labeled smart or dull, and said, "You got 2 weeks. Teach them how to run. How quickly they teach them to run through a maze. We'll see which rats run through quicker." And so they did this, and 2 weeks later, they tested them, and the rats labeled smart made it through the maze in half the time that the rats labeled dull made it through the maze. How could that be, right? So why would that be? And so what he said is, our expectations change our behavior. When we expect the rat is going to learn, it means that we do some very subtle things to them, right? What he found is that the rats who were labeled smart, the research assistants spent more time with them. They petted them more. And the other thing is they would, I guess when they pet them, one thing that I just learned is that when you pet the back of a rat's neck, it stimulates brain growth. Who knew? You can talk about that at dinner tonight, right? Like, that's fascinating. So anyways, so that's rats. But how does that apply to students? He did the same thing in an elementary school. This is the 1970s. And he went in and he told teachers, here are the high IQ kids in your class, and here are the low IQ kids in your class. Again, random. He did not do any testing. He just wanted to see what would happen if we randomly assigned kids to either being the teacher believing they were smart, teacher believing they were going to struggle. And then he took a look at how much achievement, took a look at learning growth, academic growth over the course of the year. And again, the kids who were labeled smart made twice the academic growth as the kids who were labeled as having low IQ. Now, hopefully we're not holding kids more and rubbing the backs of their neck, right? So what could it be, right? And here's what he found. We treat students differently when we believe in them. And here's what they found, is that we're just a little bit more friendly. We sit closer to them. We make more eye contact with them. We give them more detailed feedback. We call on them more. The fascinating thing is, you know what all these things are? These are all belonging cues, aren't they? All of these things say you belong here, right? Peter Block says, what makes community building so complex is it occurs in an infinite number of small steps in the quiet, sometimes in the quiet moments we only notice out of the corner of our eye. We may not even realize that we're making more eye contact with this student than that student. There's another piece of research that I also find fascinating. It's by David Yeager. It's called Wise Feedback. And what he said, he gave, it's a low resource middle school in Texas, and he gave all the kids, had to write an essay. And on half of the essays, he had the teacher grade them as they normally would. And on half the essays, they put this one sentence, the teacher wrote this one sentence. I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know you can reach them. What does that say? You're part of this group. This group is special. We have high expectations, and I believe that you can reach those expectations. And so then what they did was they offered for kids, you can revise the paper or not. They wanted to see how many kids in each condition chose to revise the paper. 40% that didn't get the wise feedback, but 80% of the kids who got the wise feedback redid the paper. And then they took a look at how many revisions did they make on those papers. The kids with the wise feedback made 5.5 revisions compared to 2.2. You know where belonging interventions really show up? Is when you have compared with kids who have more historically not felt a sense of belonging in our schools. It kind of highlights this. So this is for white students who received the feedback, 87% of them revised the paper, but 62% revised it without it. Black students, 17% of black students without the feedback revised the paper, but 72% with the feedback did. Belonging interventions are a cue to who doesn't experience belonging here. There's a 77% reduction in the racial achievement gap. And so what we've got to remember is that our expectations change our behavior. And we have implicit and explicit expectations, some that we're aware of, some that we're not. But it's essential that we're aware and intentional of the messages we're communicating to our kids. Dan Cates, he's a former superintendent at District 211, 5 high schools, 12,000 kids. And on his breaks, when he had lunch and he didn't have any lunch meetings, he would go to the cafeteria of one of his high schools and just hang with the kids. And one day he was hanging with these kids, and it was a pretty diverse group of kids. He says, "Wait, what classes are you taking?" And all the white kids were saying, "I'm taking AP classes." And none of the kids of color were taking AP classes. And so he's like, "Well, why aren't you guys taking AP classes?" And he says, "I'll never forget this. One of them looked at me and said, 'Dr. Cates, you know those classes aren't meant for us.'" And so he decided he wanted to do some research on it. And what he found is that 58% of white kids were taking at least one AP class, 28% of black kids, 35% of Hispanic kids, and 35% of kids who are economically disadvantaged. And so he says, we want to get everybody up to this goal. And so I love what he did. He said to the teachers, he said, think about the kids who aren't taking an AP class, who don't see themselves as AP people. I want you to hear these gold embossed invitations, and I want you to handwrite why you think these students should take an AP class. And so they handed these out, and kids then went to an assembly for kids who had never taken an AP class, just kind of an introduction to an AP class. And so they had to hand in, for attendance, they would hand in their invitation. And a lot of the kids said, I've never received anything like this. Can I keep it? Do I have to give it to you? And so this is a message that says, I see you, I believe in you. Structured us ourselves as the adults in the building to say, I want to make sure that the kids who don't necessarily feel seen are seen. And sure enough, over 4 years, black kids, 28% to 51%, Hispanic kids, 35% to 54%, economically disadvantaged kids, 35% to 53%. But the white kids also went up. So he says, here's our goal now. But it is amazing when we can be intentional, what can happen. What David Yeager says, it's a worldwide view and a suite of behaviors. It's not, people wanted to just get photocopies of that wise feedback. And he's like, no, that's not how it works. It's when we believe in kids, we show up differently with them. My teacher thought I was smarter than I was, so I was. So I want you just to take a minute. One of the things that I often tell the story of Miles in this case, because I wouldn't have imagined Miles would have become the person that Miles became, or Sarah, who was the teacher, but especially for Miles, I wouldn't have seen that. I'm not sure if I wouldn't have seen that because of his behavior, some implicit bias I have that didn't see that in him. I don't know. But what I realize as I do this is that there are kids. I want to say that I believe equally in all kids, and if the truth is I don't. The truth is that there are kids in my mind, as much as hard as I'm going to work, I'm not going to give them the same eye contact. I'm not going to, unless I'm intentional, unless I realize and recognize my bias that shows up in ways that I don't realize, and it requires us to be intentional in ways we aren't otherwise. And so I guess I want you to think of a student who would benefit from you changing your expectations for them. Just take a minute. Is there a student? And I guess what I want to say is there's no shame in this, because I think we all struggle with this. So take a minute and just think, tomorrow when I see this student, I'm going to find a way to give a message of belief that's going to come out of my eyes, it's going to come through my words, it's going to come through my body language, and it's going to persist through the rest of the year. So strategy 6. This is something you can't do anything about, but I find it fascinating. So it is something schools can do something about. So, what if one intervention caused significant spikes in reading and math achievement, improved outcomes of your least effective teachers, and was even more effective with your lowest achieving students? Would you do it? Who wouldn't do it, right? So, here's the interesting thing. They took a look in North Carolina and found that they studied millions of students, and some 4th and 5th grade classrooms had a spike in reading and math. And so they identified the 7,000 teachers. And what were they doing that was different? Well, it wasn't what the teachers were doing. They didn't have better teachers, but they had their teachers for 2 years. Has anyone ever been in a classroom either as an educator or as a student and looped? I see some nods. Yeah, a lot of people who do that, like I'll do this and they'll say, I love that. That was great. What I realized at North Shore Academy, we were constantly looping. We had the same kids for 3 years, right? And they wondered, okay, is this a fluke? But they replicated it with 1 million students in Indiana, and they had the same results. Adam Grant, who summarized this, says, with another year to get to know each student personally, teachers got a deeper grasp of their students and their challenges, their strengths and challenges. They're able to tailor their instructional and emotional support to help everyone in the classroom reach their potential. The nuanced, tacit knowledge that they gained about each student isn't lost in the handoff to the following year's teacher. What about students getting stuck with a less effective teacher for 2 years, right? That's what we'd worry about. Or a teacher getting stuck with the hardest kid, right? Looping actually had the greatest upside for the less effective teachers and lower achieving students. Building an extended relationship did the most good for the teachers and students who were struggling. Because that's what belonging does. That's what getting to know one another does. That's how, because we are attuned to one another in a whole different way. It's a belonging intervention. So I know we can't go ahead and figure out, let's just start looping tomorrow. I get that. But I also think it's just a fascinating piece of research. All right. The last strategy is, can we invite instead of exclude when kids struggle? There was something I think that impacted our belonging in our schools that came before NCLB, and that was Columbine. You know, in Columbine, in the aftermath of that, schools understandably, and since then, have said, we need to make sure this doesn't happen. Of course, we haven't been able to do that, but how do we prevent that? And the way we prevent that is by having zero tolerance policies. So this was what we decided to do. We're gonna have zero tolerance policies so that nobody who shows any sign of risk will be entering our school buildings. The good news now is that we've got 25 years of research on zero tolerance policies. Let's see what happens. What's been going on with zero tolerance policies? What we know is that there's an impact on the student and on the school. For students, what we know is that kids who experience one suspension are less likely to graduate and more likely to have a law enforcement involvement. We also know that the kids who are most vulnerable to having law enforcement involvement are kids who are black, brown, disabled, poor, and male. So we don't do this equally, number one. But what we say is this is the cost of keeping our schools safe. So let's take a look at that. So zero tolerance policies, you know, it's interesting. Zero tolerance policies are meant to create norms that promote order, but actually in those schools there's more hostility. In zero tolerance communities, kids have lower test scores and lower trust in staff and have higher apathy and higher anxiety. Because when we feel like we make one mistake and then we're going to get booted out, it becomes cultural. But how can other students learn if we don't suspend the disruptive and dangerous kids, right? When schools serving similar populations were compared, those with relatively low suspension rates had higher, not lower test scores. Test scores go down when we exclude kids. And this is why State Bill 100, Office of Civil Rights, Restorative Practices, Trauma-Informed Care, U.S. Department of Education are all saying the same thing. Is anyone surprised to see the United States Secret Service on this list? What do they have to do with this? Well, it's interesting. I didn't realize this. I thought they were just meant to protect politicians, but what they do is they're meant to protect communities. What they did, they're the ones who created the Safe Schools Initiative. And the Department of Education was upset about this. The Department of Education said, what's going to happen if we have these law enforcement people saying we're just going to throw the book at these kids? But what the law enforcement people said was just the opposite. That at the top of their list was when kids show up high on our behavioral risk assessment, we need to connect with them more, not less. We need to figure out we don't exclude them from our community. That actually makes them more dangerous. What we want to do is we want to figure out who's their favorite teacher. Let's get them with their favorite teacher more. What's their favorite class? Let's get them doing that more. That this is our work. So Dan Cates, I talked to him about him a little while before, good friend of mine. He did something really interesting with suspensions too. He was an assistant superintendent, and his job was to reduce suspensions. And so what he decided to do, and it was not met with great, it was not very popular among the staff at first. But he said, as an alternative to suspension, you can join a club. What's that saying? We want you here more, not less. And he said, if there's not a club you want, I'll sponsor it. You tell me what it is, get some people, we will sponsor that club. And take a look at his data. In 2011, there were 2,457 suspension days. 8 years later, it was down to 514. 80% reduction. Right? We can do this and keep our schools safe. There's a student at North Shore Academy, Josh. He came to us. He was getting in fights in school, fights in the community. He was 15 years old, sophomore. Had failed out of 2 drug treatment programs. Came to us because we would do drug treatment. We had treatment groups. We had assessments. We had drug screens. All of that stuff. So his parents brought him to us. And he didn't love school. He was a nice kid, but he was bouncing around. He had a hard time sitting still. And within 3 weeks, he hopped in a car with another North Shore Academy student and some other students, drove into Chicago, bought heroin, and before they reached the city limits, he had overdosed. And the people in the car left him in a gas station parking lot. Paramedics came, and he was revived. And Josh, once he was medically cleared, his parents took him up to Hazelden in Minnesota for inpatient treatment. And on the way back, I got a call from his dad, and his dad said, Josh makes his own choices. Oh, you're not responsible for Josh's choices, but I will say that you told us that you had all these things that would help him with his substance use, and clearly that was not helpful. And I couldn't disagree with him. We had too many kids at risk. And so we worked with it as a team. We tried to figure out what can we do, and we spent several months kind of figuring out how can we intensify our programming. But 4 months later, before we had been able to implement anything, I get another call from his dad. And his dad says, Josh is getting out, and we want him to come back to North Shore Academy. And I'm like, we'd love to have him back, but after our last conversation, I guess I'm curious about why you would want him to come back. And he said, Josh has been in a lot of schools and a lot of programs. And he said that he's never felt cared about like he did in his 3 weeks at North Shore Academy. And if he's going to kick this addiction, that's the place he needs to be. So Josh came back. And the thing about Josh was he hated school, but he was actually really good at connecting with people. And so we doubled down on belonging with him. Not just that we knew that he felt a sense of belonging, but we also made sure that he helped create belonging for other people. And he was really good at it. We put him in with our middle school classroom. Every afternoon, he'd go up and spend 2 periods with our middle school classroom. And he was like the Pied Piper They would cheer when he walked in, and they would scream and yell when he left, right? It was a little bit hard, you know, parents, middle school parents would say, who's this young kid with all these tats showing up? I know he's got drug problems and he's violent. And then a few weeks later, they'd say, why can't Josh spend more time up there? My kid's always on task when he's in the room, right? And so Josh ended up doing this work, and it was, you know, beautiful, beautiful work with that classroom. And he stayed sober. And he would talk to kids who were also struggling with the decision about whether or not to go to treatment. And as a clinician, I just listened to him, and I'd realize, I can't do nearly the work that you're doing right now. He was so good at listening, so good at being attuned to the challenges these kids faced. So after a few years, he graduates. Here he is on his graduation day, and he grabs his diploma, and he shakes my hand, and he leans in. He says, I'm so happy. He says, I never have to read another book in my life. Not what I was expecting, right? And so Josh goes and becomes an apprentice in electrical engineering in the South Side, but he has Fridays off. And on those Fridays, he'd come back and he'd visit North Shore Academy, and he'd go back to that same classroom. And so he did this for a couple years, and then one day after he left, I found this on my desk, and he says, Smith, and Dr. Bolton Smith Miss Smith was his therapist, Sue Smith. I was blessed to have 5 years sober May 1st. Here's my chip I promised you. NSA has had a strong influence on my sobriety. You guys showed me what it's like to be kind and help others. I am forever grateful. Show this chip to any student struggling, because it's possible to live a good life and get out of that misery and addiction. If I can do it, anyone can. Thank you for your help. I hope to continue one day at a time. So Josh's story doesn't end there. So one of these times he comes back and he says, I'm quitting electrical engineering. I'm enrolled as a student in Northeastern Illinois social work program. I want to become a social worker. And after a few months, he says, these books are so helpful. I love reading now, right? It's like that prefrontal cortex all of a sudden was able to do this, right? And so what do you have to do to be a school social worker? You've got to do an internship. So here he is on his interview day to be an intern with us. And there he is, and there's Miss Smith, his therapist, who became his supervisor. Guess what? He did get the job. And then she retired, and guess who became a therapist at North Shore Academy? One of the most gifted, naturally gifted clinicians. I'm still in touch with him. But here's the thing. There are times when people have to leave. Josh needed to leave to get the help he needed. There are kids who are too disruptive to be in a classroom. They need to leave. It's not whether kids have to leave. The question is, how do we welcome them back? Do we take full opportunity to say, this is our opportunity to reestablish belonging, to create belonging? But often what we do is they come back and say, if you do that again, it's going to be 2 periods. It's going to be 2 days in the in-school suspension. We threaten them. The question is, when students leave, how do we welcome them back? With a wave of a finger, or saying, we're not the same class without you. We got to understand why this is so hard for you. It's hard for us when you're struggling. Let's figure this out together, because you're too important here. This is the essence of restorative practices. It's about being accountable to the relationships, not to a detention, not to a suspension, not to an essay. It's responsible to the people that I've harmed, right? It's the practice of restoring relationships with people in a community after I've caused harm. But in order to implement restorative practices, we need relationships to restore. And I'll tell you what, when I'm in that community, in that toxic place, I'm like, no, people need to apologize for me. It's lucky this didn't happen sooner. You wouldn't believe all this stuff I've got to go through every day. If I harm people in this community, I feel a very different sense of accountability. And here's the thing, everybody has a story. You know, we talked about this, trauma and behavior problems. Oftentimes, there's a story of trauma. Can we be curious in these moments? Remember, everyone in the classroom has a story that leads to misbehavior or defiance. 9 times out of 10, the story behind the misbehavior won't make you angry. It'll break your heart. So when a student has to leave class, how do we welcome them back? How do we restore belonging? All right, I'm just going to move through, and we'll wrap up here. You know, data is essential. Don't get me wrong. We want to be able to measure kids' achievement. That's essential, right? But community always comes first. Has anyone ever heard of the restaurant 11 Madison Park? It's in New York. And these guys started 11 Madison Park. And within a couple years, they were named in 2010, they were named among the world's 50 best restaurants. And to celebrate that, they invited all of these restaurant people to London, where they would unveil who the number one was, right? And so they're in there and they're walking in and they're like, well, are we 28? Maybe we're 35, you know, where are we? And so the ceremony starts, and 50th best restaurant in the world is 11 Madison Park. And they feel terrible. They're like, we may be one of the 50th best restaurants in the world, but we're the worst restaurant in this building right now, and this is humiliating. We don't ever want to experience that again. Anybody watch The Bear? So The Bear, Noma that year was number one. That's the restaurant in Copenhagen they all go to. So that's a real place. But their goal then was, we want to be number one. But here's the thing. They didn't do anything to change where the food was sourced. They didn't change the menu. They didn't change the chefs. What they said is, what would happen if we approached hospitality with the same passion, attention to detail, and rigor that we bring to our food? They focused on how people felt, how people belonged. And 7 years later, there they are, number one. What would happen if we approached belonging with the same passion, attention to detail, and rigor that we bring to achievement? Imagine what would happen. We don't trust that, right? We don't trust that if we invest there, that the test scores will come. There is a district who did that. It's District 50. And here's what they did. They took a look. They focused on the wellness of using the positivity work of Sean Acor. And then they did the happiness work. They did mindful work. And then we did belonging. They did no external instructional or curricular trainings. They only did that within their own teams. They did their work, but they only had their own people doing that. And take a look at what happened to their test scores. They went from a 73% in 2016 to the 95th percentile in math and ELA in 8 years. Just focusing on wellness, focusing on belonging. The data is there for us. So Pearl Harbor was a hard day in American history. The thing that I didn't know about Pearl Harbor was that the clues were there. Anybody hear this story? Genevieve Grochin, she was a code breaker, and she broke the diplomatic code 6 weeks before the attack. But you know what? The code breakers weren't talking to the military. The military never got the message. The same thing happened in 9/11. The FBI and the CIA weren't working together. If they were working together, they would have. The CIA would have. I think it was the CIA that would have let the FBI know that the people they could have gotten them in Thailand before they ever entered the United States. What they talk about is there's an integration error. The right people need to be in the right place at the right time, focusing on the right information. Here's the thing, in our schools, the clues are there. Our kids are hurting in unprecedented ways. The clues are there. Our staff are hurting in unprecedented ways. But here's the thing. I think that we can crack the code. I believe that we can. One classroom, one student at a time, one school at a time. There's never been a more important time to be an educator. Our fellow educators and our students have never needed us more. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. How can we begin to design a system within our role that helps us to really see and create belonging for kids, to help them when they struggle to see it as regulation and stress and not as laziness or defiance? That's our work. All right. Just take a minute. I guess I want you just to let's pause and ponder for a second, like Mary Jo would say. So both feet flat on the ground. Take a deep breath. You know, it's a long day. Thank you all for hanging with it. And I guess what I want you to do is just think of what's one thing. If you take one thing out of this that you can implement, or one thing that's going to drive you forward, one story, one idea, one strategy. And when you land on one, I want you just to turn with a partner and just share what that is. What's your one takeaway from today? And then I've got one more story and we'll get you out of here. All right, one more story. So, growing up, we had a cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, and it was on a lake. It was a really remote area, and it was on a lake that turned into a river, so a lot of canoers would go by. And my parents were divorced, and one night, I was about 8 years old, and it was still kind of light out, but it was time to go to bed. It was 9 o'clock. And so my mom gets up and she turns on the floodlights. And it's the 1970s, and all we're taught is save electricity, save power, because there was an energy crisis, right? So I'm like, Mom, what are you doing? You shouldn't be turning the lights on when it's time to go to bed. And she says, here's the thing. This is a really remote area. And I want to make sure that if anybody needs help, they know that we're here. So that made sense to me. And I went to bed. Well, about a month later, there's a pounding at the door at about 1 a.m. And my mom gets up to go to the door, and I'm behind her, and she opens the door, and there's this really big, kind of tough, scary-looking guy. And I'm like, oh, this is why you don't have to leave the lights on, right? And but she had her... he had his arm around his 11-year-old daughter, who had her hand over her eye. And he said, we got into camp late, I was breaking twigs for kindling, and a splinter went in my daughter's eye. And I'm afraid she's lost her vision. So my mom piled him into the station wagon and drove him to 2 really remote medical centers before they found a doctor who repaired the eye, removed the splinter, repaired the eye, and she retained her vision. So they come back, and then as daybreak is starting, they paddle their way back to their campsite. And about midday, we see them paddling back down our way, and they stop at our dock, and they take out, and we come down, and they're like, we're so grateful, and they start taking out all their camping equipment. And they say, we're so grateful, we want you to have all of our equipment, because we're never camping again, right? Like, true story. Yeah, we're not doing that. That was a bad idea, right? But here's the thing. I guess this is my message for all kids, but especially for kids who struggle to experience belonging, who struggle to experience feeling seen. Can we be a beacon of light for them? Can they know when they walk into school that there is a beacon of light to shine on them and help them feel like they truly belong, that this is their place, and that we believe in them and we care about them, and when they struggle, we see their struggle through the lens of, wow, your life is hard, not through, wow, you're making things harder on everybody else. Thank you so much for today. I'm so grateful to all of you and for this opportunity. Thank you. And if you want to get in touch with me, just if you have any questions or I can be a thought partner, there's my email. Here's my website. And if one book isn't enough, feel free to buy more. Thanks so much.